Imagine yourself wandering slowly along a narrow medieval lane, just as the evening folds itself over the rooftops. The stones beneath your feet are cool with the damp of the day, and the sound of your steps is softened by the hush of twilight. Lanterns flicker in their iron brackets, their glow casting halos of warm amber light against timber-bird walls. The smell of wood smoke lingers in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of bread still cooling in village ovens. Somewhere, a river flows steadily, its surface catching the last of the fading light, while the surrounding meadows lie quiet under the softening sky. It is here, in this gentle hour, that we begin our slow walk backward in time into the steady and rhythmic world of the medieval weaver. The Middle Ages are often remembered for their castles, their knights, and their grand histories written in stone and steel. But beneath these louder tales was another world, the quieter life of craftspeople, whose hands shaped the very fabric of daily existence. Among them, the weaver stood as both artisan and provider, transforming simple fibers from the meadow sheep, flax from the sunlit fields, into cloth that touched every moment of life. Tonight, we will not dwell on battles or crowns. Instead, we will pause in the calm glow of the hearth and listen to the almost musical rhythm of the loom, the gentle shush of the shuttle as it passes through the warp, and the soft creak of wooden beams as cloth slowly comes into being. Imagine the interior of a cottage, humble yet warm. The floor is packed earth, swept clean and strewn with a scattering of reeds to soften each step. The hearth, always alive with glowing embers, spreads its heat through the room, warming the bench where spinning is done and lighting the corners where tools lean quietly in their places. The loom itself stands like a wooden giant, taking up nearly an entire wall, its frame broad and tall. By the window, more often an open shutter than glasslight falls across the taut lines of thread. The air smells faintly of wool washed and dried, of flax combed and bundled, and of herbs hung from the beams to cure. Here, in this room, the sounds of medieval life are soft and steady. The crackle of fire, the murmur of voices, and the slow, patient clatter of weaving. To weave was more than a skill, it was a rhythm, a way of living tied to both the seasons and the needs of the family. In the spring, sheep were sheared, their fleece gathered and washed in the river, the cool water carrying away the dust of the meadow. In summer, flax fields bloomed with delicate blue flowers, waving lightly in the breeze until they were pulled and soaked, their stems softened for fiber. Autumn brought spinning, hours by the hearth, spent twisting strands into thread, while winter opened the long evenings for weaving itself, when daylight was scarce and lamplight guided the shuttle's path. The weaver's life was, in this way, inseparable from the turning of the year, each task carried along by the larger rhythm of nature. Picture, if you will, the act of weaving itself. The weaver sits with quiet concentration, their hands guiding the shuttle through the warp. With each pass, a line of weft settles in place, pressed gently by the beater. The sound is not loud, but it is steady and ancient, patient cadence. To listen for long is to feel the body grow calm, lulled by the repetition, as if the loom itself were breathing in and out. The work is both ordinary and miraculous. From loose strands of fiber emerges a fabric strong enough to clothe, to protect, to wrap infants, to shield travelers from rain, to soften the sleep of the weary. And yet, the beauty of weaving lay not only in the finished cloth, but in the small details along the way. Threads, carefully dyed with colors from the earth, carried the muted richness of their origin: soft reds from madder roots, deep blues from woad, golden yellows from weld, and browns from walnut husks. When woven together, these colors echoed the very landscape of the weaver's life: the fields, the woods, the rivers, and the soil. Patterns appeared quietly, sometimes no more than a simple stripe or a repeating motif, yet they carried with them the pride of the household. These designs were not meant to dazzle, but to endure, like whispers of beauty woven into the everyday. The loom was often a household's greatest possession, standing sturdily even when other furnishings were sparse. Its presence shaped the rhythm of family life. Children played near its base, watching their parents practice movements. Neighbors stopped by and measured time by the sight of cloth slowly growing. In towns, larger weaving halls echoed with the sound of many looms, working in unison. But in villages, weaving remained moments stretched by the patience required of the craft. In every stage of life, cloth was present. A newborn was swaddled in freshly spun linen. A bride stepped into garments woven with care by family or community hands. A traveler wrapped themselves against the cold, with wool woven in winter evenings. Even in death, the final covering was cloth, plain, simple, and dignified. In this way, weaving formed an invisible thread through medieval existence, binding together generations with quiet resilience. When we think of weaving today, we may imagine great tapestries hung in castles, adorned with bright scenes and intricate figures. But the true story lies not in grandeur but in simplicity. The greater part of medieval weaving was humble and practical, meant to warm, to shelter, and to endure. It was not made for display, but for life, for the needs of families, villages, and communities who relied upon the quiet persistence of the loom. In the end, it was this modest, everyday cloth that carried the weight of history, shaping how people lived, worked, and rested. So as you rest now, let the image of this gentle craft settle around you. Picture the soft flicker of lamplight on polished wood, the muted colors of homespun fabric folded neatly in chests, the calm rhythm of spinning wheels and the steady beat of the loom. Hear the distant sounds of sheep in the meadow, rivers flowing past, flax laid to soften, and voices low with patience and care. This was a world where time was measured, not in hours or minutes, but in threads passed from hand to hand, line by line, until a whole cloth emerged, quiet, enduring, and necessary. Let your thoughts drift with the threads of that fabric, woven softly in the cottages of long ago. Feel the weight of a woolen cloak across your shoulders, the cool smoothness of linen beneath your hand, the warmth of a hearth as light flickers across stone walls. In the stillness of the night, the world of the medieval weaver becomes a kind of lullaby, its rhythm steady, its purpose timeless. And as you close your eyes, remember that history is not always made of great events. Sometimes it is woven quietly, in the background, in the hands of those who worked patiently, softly, day after day, never in haste. Their gift to the world was not noise or spectacle, but a steady thread of comfort and survival. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let that thread wrap gently around you, carrying you into dreams woven as carefully as the cloth of ages past. The day begins quietly in the heart of a medieval village, before the church bell rings its first note, before the rooster calls from the byre. The weaver's cottage is already alive with its own gentle rhythm. Imagine the first pale light of dawn slipping through the shutters, not glass but wooden slats, softened by a hanging cloth of woven linen that filters the glow into a muted silver. The air is cool, carrying the dampness of night, but the hearth holds a red core of embers, glowing softly in the dimness, ready to be coaxed awake with a few careful breaths and the laying of small kindling. The smell is comforting and familiar, wood smoke mingled with the earthy scent of wool, and perhaps the faint trace of bread baked the evening before. This is not the life of kings or knights or courts, but of a household where weaving stands at the very center, shaping the rhythm of each day in quiet persistence. The loom dominates the room. It is the largest object in the home, a tall and sturdy frame of oak or ash, filling a corner like a wooden giant. Its presence cannot be ignored, for it is both tool and companion, always waiting, its warp threads strung tight and patient, like the strings of an instrument yet to be played. Around it, the rest of the cottage seems to bend and organize itself. A small hearth with iron pots, benches worn smooth from years of use, a chest for storing cloth, wool, and simple garments. Bundles of flax lean against the wall, drying after being retted in nearby streams. Herbs hang from the beams to cure for winter. Baskets hold carded fleece. Combs of wood and bone rest close at hand, and spindles lie neatly coiled with freshly spun thread. This is not clutter but order, each piece part of the slow cycle of weaving, spinning, dyeing, and preparing. The space may seem humble to our eyes, but to those who lived within it, it was complete and filled with meaning. The family stirs with the light. The mother bends to coax the fire until flames flicker again, warming the room and softening the chill that clings to the morning air. The father checks the tension of the warp threads, his hands moving with a confidence born of repetition. Children, younger and older, stir from their straw-filled beds. The youngest rub sleep from their eyes, while the older ones already know their tasks: to fetch water from the well, to help wind bobbins, or to carry small bundles of wool from basket to bench. Breakfast is simple but steady. Coarse bread, baked in the communal oven and eaten with butter, cheese, or perhaps a little honey if the season has been kind. Ale, weak and nourishing, is drunk instead of water. It fills the stomach, provides warmth, and sustains work through the early hours. These small rituals set the rhythm of the day, a rhythm as dependable as the passing of light through the shutter. Soon, the loom awakens. The weaver sits at his bench, his body framed by the tall loom that looms like a wooden gateway. He checks the threads once more, adjusting their tautness. He picks up the shuttle, already wound with yarn, and slides it through the opening between the warp threads. It glides with practiced ease, passing from one hand to the other, carrying the weft across. Then comes the beater, brought down with gentle firmness to press the new line into place. The motion repeats, over and over, shuttle through, beater down, threads shifted, shuttle back. It is simple, yet endlessly complex, requiring patience, rhythm, and a quiet attention that does not waver. The sound fills the room with a soft music, the creak of the wooden frame bearing the tension, the faint slap of the beater striking home, the hush of the shuttle sliding between the threads. It is not loud, but steady, a heartbeat of labor. Children grow up with this rhythm in their ears, as familiar as the tolling of the church bell, as comforting as the crackle of fire in the hearth. Life in the weaver's home is deeply human. The wife may sit nearby, distaff and spindle in hand, twisting wool into thread while watching the fire. Her fingers move almost automatically, each twist and pull part of a rhythm learned from her own mother years before. Older children help, with carding, teasing wool into soft clouds ready for spinning, or winding spun thread onto bobbins that feed the loom. Even the smallest child finds amusement in scraps of yarn, their little hands tugging at colorful strands while absorbing the sights and sounds of their parents' work. This labor, though repetitive, is never without meaning. Each step adds to the whole. Each hand contributes, however small, to the cloth that will one day warm, protect, and endure. Weaving is livelihood. It is survival. Cloth is precious, often more valuable than coin, and the ability to create it provides both comfort and trade. A bolt of woven wool can be exchanged in the market for food, tools, or favors. Linen, smooth and light, can be sold for garments or stored away in chests as a family's wealth. To weave is not merely to fill the hours, but to secure the future. Yet for all its necessity, weaving is also a source of quiet pride. A weaver knows the strength of his cloth, the neatness of his weave, the subtle beauty of his patterns. The finished fabric, folded neatly on a bench or chest, carries the dignity of hours well spent. Step outside the cottage, and the village greets the day. Smoke rises from chimneys, curling against the pale sky. Roosters crow, dogs bark, and neighbors call to each other as they carry water, tend to animals, or head to the fields. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth, of sheep in the meadow, of bread baking once more. Life moves slowly here, bound to the rhythms of season and soil. Farmers plow, shepherds watch their flocks, bakers stoke ovens, and blacksmiths spark fires in their forges. Each trade has its rhythm, and the weaver's is the quiet music of thread and shuttle. By mid-morning, the loom's steady song joins the chorus of village life, as natural as wind through trees or bells over fields. The weaver lives with both hope and worry. Hope that the threads will hold, that the dye will take, that the cloth will fetch a fair price. Worry that illness or poor harvests may leave the family vulnerable. But the loom is constant. It is a companion that does not change with fortune. Every day the same rhythm, the same progress, row by row, thread by thread, cloth that grows beneath the hands. In a world often uncertain, this slow creation is a source of strength, a quiet reminder that patient effort leaves a mark upon the world. As the day draws on, the weaver's arms grow heavy, and the light changes from pale silver to warm gold. The cloth on the loom lengthens, its surface smooth beneath the hand, its strength hidden within each careful line. When the sun begins to set, shadows stretch across the cottage, and the family gathers again at the hearth. A pot of pottage simmers slowly, grains thickened with beans or root vegetables, flavored with herbs hung from the rafters. The smell fills the air, warm and familiar. Children eat with contentment, then curl into straw beds covered with blankets, woven by the very loom that towers nearby. The fire sinks low, embers glowing faintly. As the cottage grows quiet, the loom stands in silence now, its work complete for the day. It seems almost alive in the firelight, its frame holding the threads like lines of captured light, waiting patiently for the morning. Outside, the sky darkens, stars emerge one by one, and the village sinks into stillness. The rhythm of weaving has ended, but only for the night. Tomorrow, as dawn slips once more through the shutters, the loom will awaken again, and the cycle will begin anew, simple, steady, and enduring. The life of the weaver is not dramatic, not filled with battles or proclamations, but it is woven with patience and care. In every fold of cloth lies a story, of mornings by the hearth, of children winding bobbins, of fields of flax and meadows of sheep, of hands that worked with diligence and hearts that found quiet pride in their labor. To imagine the weaver's cottage in the morning light is to understand that history is not only written in castles or carved in stone, but also woven, softly and steadily, into the fabric of everyday life. Cloth began long before the loom was ever touched, long before the shuttle slid through the warp or the beater pressed each row into place. It began in the fields and meadows, in the quiet care of sheep grazing slowly across rolling hills, and in the patient sowing of flax seeds that would sprout into slender stalks crowned with delicate blue flowers. The life of a medieval weaver was tied not only to wood and thread, but to the landscape itself, for without sheep and flax there would be no wool, no linen, no cloth to shelter the body from cold and heat. To understand weaving, one must first step into the fields, where the earliest stages of the craft were sown and tended, season by season, in a rhythm as old as the land itself. Imagine yourself walking across a meadow in springtime. The air is cool yet gentle, carrying the faint smell of damp earth just beginning to warm under the sun. The ground is soft with new grass, and scattered wildflowers begin to open their petals to the light. In this quiet place, sheep graze in small groups, their movements unhurried, their heads bent low as they nibble at the tender shoots. Their wool has grown thick through the winter, a fleece heavy with lanolin that glistens faintly when touched by morning dew. The animals move slowly, and the only sounds are the tearing of grass, the occasional bleat of a lamb calling for its mother, and the soft rush of wind across the meadow. These sheep are more than animals. They are the promise of warmth and survival, the living storehouses of wool that, once shorn, washed, and spun, will become cloaks, blankets, and tunics. Tending sheep was a task both simple and endless. Shepherds rose early, leading flocks to pasture, watching them throughout the day, and guiding them home again in the evening. Their work was steady, often lonely, but essential. Without their care, there could be no fleece, and without fleece there could be no wool. A medieval weaver, even if he never held a shepherd's crook, depended upon this rhythm of care. In the villages, everyone felt the closeness of sheep, for their bleating filled the air, their grazing shaped the land, and their wool, once gathered, touched every household. Children grew up knowing the feel of raw fleece, soft, yet greasy, thick, with lanolin smelling faintly of earth and animal. For them, the sight of sheep across the meadow was not a picture of the countryside, but a sign of life itself, a reassurance that the coming year would bring warmth against the cold. And then there was flax. Unlike sheep, it grew quietly in fields, planted by human hands in rows that looked almost like ordinary crops. Yet flax was unlike wheat or barley, for it was not raised for food but for fiber. When the seeds were scattered and the earth pressed lightly over them, it began as little more than a faint green haze across the soil. But with patience and the turning of weeks, the stalks rose slender and tall, their leaves narrow, their stems strong yet flexible. By midsummer, fields of flax shimmered under the sun, crowned with flowers of the palest blue, each petal thin and delicate as a breath of sky. The sight was one of quiet beauty, soft and unassuming. Yet to the weaver it was the beginning of linen, the cloth prized for its smoothness and lightness, so different from wool, yet equally vital. The harvesting of flax was done by hand, and it was not cut but pulled, root and all, from the soil. Bundles of stalks were gathered together, tied, and carried to streams or ponds where they were laid to soak. This process, called retting, allowed the outer parts of the plant to soften, so the long inner fibers could be freed. For days, sometimes weeks, the flax rested in water, its stems darkening, its smells sharp and earthy. Villagers passing by a retting pool would wrinkle their noses at the scent, yet they understood its necessity. Without this step, the fibers could not be separated, and without fibers, there could be no linen thread. The land itself seemed part of the process, for the fields provided the stalks, and the water of streams and rivers lent its hand in loosening them. When the retting was complete, the flax was dried, broken, and combed, until what remained were long strands, pale and silky, ready to be spun into fine thread. To walk through these landscapes was to understand the deep bond between cloth and nature. Every bolt of fabric that came from a loom carried with it the memory of fields and meadows, of shepherds guiding sheep, of farmers bending to pull flax from the soil, of streams flowing over bundles laid carefully in their waters. In this way, cloth was never just a human creation. It was a partnership between land, water, and labor. The weaver might sit at his loom, but behind him stood the quiet work of seasons and the patient gifts of nature. The rhythms of sheep and flax shaped not only weaving but the lives of the villagers who depended upon them. Each spring, the shearing of sheep was a moment both practical and communal. Flocks were gathered, and shearers, with simple iron shears, clipped away the heavy fleece. The sheep bleated and shifted nervously, yet when freed of their wool they bounded away with lightened bodies. The fleece, warm and greasy, was piled high, smelling strongly of lanolin and earth. Families washed it in streams, beating it against stones, letting the water carry away dirt and grease. Children helped, their laughter mixing with the splash of water, their small hands learning the first steps in the long journey from fleece to cloth. The work was tiring, yet it carried a kind of joy, for it marked the turning of the year and the promise of new woolen garments to come. Flax too had its rhythms. Its sowing marked the spring, its flowering filled the summer, and its harvest carried the promise of linen that would be smooth and cool against the skin. Villagers knew its demands, knew how to judge the stalks, when to pull them, how long to soak them, how best to dry them. Each step was patient, each step slow, for there was no way to rush the transformation of plant into fiber. When the bundles were finally combed into strands ready for spinning, they gleamed softly, a pale gold in the light, as if the summer sun itself had been captured within them. The weaver, though he might spend his days at the loom, lived always with the awareness of these origins. When he touched wool, he felt the meadow. When he handled linen, he remembered the fields of blue flowers. Every thread carried with it a story of land, of season, of patience. To weave was to gather these stories and bind them together, creating a fabric not only of threads but of memory and place. In the evenings, when the village grew quiet and smoke curled from chimneys into the twilight air, one could still sense the closeness of sheep in their byres and flax drying in bundles. The rhythm of daily labor did not end with the setting of the sun, for the land itself continued its slow work. Sheep chewed cud in the dark, their wool growing silently through the night. Flax dried gently in the air, fibers loosening, ready for the comb. The weaver and his family might rest, but the materials of their craft never ceased to prepare themselves, guided by the steady hand of nature. Living in a medieval village meant living close to these cycles. People did not think of cloth as separate from land or season. They felt it as a continuation of the soil beneath their feet, the animals they tended, the rivers that ran through their fields. To wear a woolen cloak was to carry the meadow upon your shoulders. To sleep beneath a linen sheet was to rest within the memory of blue fields and flowing water. Cloth was not only protection, it was a reminder of place, a thread that tied people to the landscapes that sustained them. And so, when we picture the medieval weaver, we must also picture the sheep grazing under wide skies, their fleece thick with promise, and the flax swaying in the summer light, its flowers delicate as a dream. We must hear the bleating of lambs, the rustle of stalks, the splash of water as bundles are laid to rest. These quiet, persistent rhythms are the true beginning of cloth, the gentle foundations upon which the art of weaving was built. In their patience and their persistence, they gave to the weaver the raw material of survival, and in return the weaver's work gave shape and meaning to their silent gifts. The story of weaving, then, is not only the story of looms and threads, but of fields and flocks, of seasons and streams, of the slow and nourishing bond between land and cloth. To live in a medieval village was to live within this bond, to feel it in every garment, every blanket, every thread. And tonight, as we imagine ourselves walking across meadows soft with grass or standing among fields of pale blue flowers, we too can feel something of that closeness, that quiet persistence, that enduring rhythm which wove itself softly into the very fabric of life. Before there was weaving, before the loom creaked and the shuttle whispered across the taut warp, there was spinning. Thread was the quiet beginning, the hidden root beneath the fabric that would one day clothe bodies and warm beds. And spinning itself was a slow, deliberate task, born out of patience and repeated countless times in the life of a medieval household. It was not an event, but a rhythm, a pulse that went on through every season. Women spun by the hearth in winter and in doorways in summer, their hands occupied even while their voices carried soft conversations. The work was calm, repetitive, and deeply ordinary. Yet it was also the foundation of everything that would come after. Without thread, there could be no weaving, and without weaving, there could be no cloth. Imagine a cottage at dawn, its thatched roof damp with dew, the hearth still smoldering faintly from the night before. Inside, the room is dim, lit by a thin bar of light that slips through a small shuttered window. A woman sits close to the fire, her distaff resting upright beside her, a bundle of raw fibers tied neatly at its head. In her hand, she holds a simple spindle, little more than a wooden rod weighted with a round whirl of stone or clay. She pulls a wisp of fiber from the distaff, twists it between her fingers, and sets the spindle whirling. The spindle drops, spinning in mid-air, twisting the fibers together into a slender thread. Her hand rises and falls in practiced motions, drawing out new fibers, letting them catch, feeding them into the growing line of yarn. The spindle slows. She catches it, winds the new thread onto its shaft, and sets it spinning once more. The sound is soft, a faint hum of whirling, the quiet click as it is caught, the sigh of fibers drawn smooth between practiced fingers. This was the music of spinning, not loud or dramatic, but steady, persistent, and deeply human. The repetition was a companion, its rhythm marking the hours in a way that was almost invisible. While the spindle turned, conversations flowed. A child might sit nearby, shelling peas or playing with scraps of wool. Another might fall asleep to the rise and fall of the spinning woman's hand. Stories were told during spinning. News was shared, songs were hummed absent-mindedly. The task allowed the mind to wander even as the hands stayed busy. It was work, yes, but it was also a kind of quiet thinking time, a space where generations of women turned over their hopes, worries, and memories, all while thread grew inch by inch upon the spindle. Spinning was not confined to the hearth alone. In summer, when the air was warm and the days were long, women carried their spindles outdoors. They sat in doorways, their skirts spread around them, twisting fibers as children played in the dust or as men worked in nearby fields. A spindle was light, easy to carry, and could be used almost anywhere. It was common to see women walking slowly to market or to the well with distaffs tucked under their arms, their spindles dangling as they walked. Each step was accompanied by the faint spin and catch of thread forming in mid-air. In this way, spinning wove itself into the very fabric of daily life, filling the in-between spaces of time with quiet productivity. Nothing was wasted, no hour left idle, for even while waiting or watching over children, the spindle could turn. The fibers themselves varied depending on what the land provided. Wool was common, carded and teased into soft bundles that could be spun fine or thick depending on need. Flax fibers, once retted, broken, and combed, produced smooth, pale strands that made strong linen thread. In some places, nettles and hemp were used as well, their fibers harsher yet still useful for sturdy cloth. Each fiber had its own feel under the fingers, its own demands on the spinner's patience. Wool could be forgiving, catching icily into thread. Flax required more care, its long fibers needing steady hands to avoid breaks. Whatever the material, the principle was the same. Twist, draw, wind, repeat, again and again, until fibers became thread, and thread gathered in balls or skeins ready for the loom. To spin was to learn patience. Thread did not appear quickly. A spindle might be filled only after hours of steady work, and a single garment required many spindles worth of yarn. Cloth for a household's use demanded countless hours of spinning, so much so that it often occupied every spare moment of a woman's day. Girls learned the motions early, sitting with their mothers, imitating the twist of fingers and the careful feed of fiber. By the time they grew, their hands moved almost without thought, the motions as natural as breathing, and yet, even though it was ordinary, spinning carried weight. It was the unseen beginning of every garment, every blanket, every rope of cord or sackcloth. To spin was to take the raw gifts of field and flock and shape them into something new, something that would one day protect and comfort. The spindle itself, though simple, was a tool of quiet genius. Its whirl gave balance, its shaft held the growing yarn, and its weight pulled fibers into line. In its turning, there was a balance between gravity and control, a dance between hand and tool. Sometimes spindles were plain, little more than carved sticks. Other times they were decorated, with whorls shaped from polished stone or patterned clay. They were personal objects, kept close, used daily, worn smooth by years of handling. A spindle might pass from mother to daughter, its shape carrying the memory of hands long gone, its surface polished by generations of use. There was something meditative in the act of spinning. The steady repetition lulled the mind into a calm state, the way rocking or walking can soothe. Many medieval women must have found comfort in it, even when it was part of unending labor. The thread grew almost invisibly, a few inches at a time, yet the accumulation over days and weeks was real. There was satisfaction in winding a spindle full, in seeing skeins of yarn gathered neatly, in knowing that these quiet hours had given birth to something tangible and lasting. Spinning was not dramatic, but it was deeply human, the patient creation of something from almost nothing, the transformation of loose fibers into a line of strength. In winter evenings, the hearth was the center of this work. The fire cracked and glowed, casting light over the spinner's hands. Outside, the wind might howl across fields, carrying with it the bite of frost. But inside, the family gathered, children close to the fire, men mending tools or telling stories, and always the spindle turning. It was part of the soundscape of the home, as familiar as the crackle of the fire or the murmur of voices. The spindle fell, spun, slowed, and was caught. Fingers twisted, drew, and smoothed. The cycle never ceased, a quiet rhythm beneath the larger rhythm of life. Thread was precious. Each length represented time, care, and patience. Nothing was wasted. If thread broke, it was joined again. The fibers overlapped and twisted back into unity. If a spindle cracked, another was fashioned quickly. Yarn was stored carefully, skeins wound and hung, for the household depended on them. Cloth was not something bought easily or often. It was made at home, and to have cloth, one must first have thread. To spin was not optional, it was survival. And yet, for all its necessity, it was not remembered with grandeur. Chronicles recorded kings and battles, but the true fabric of life was spun quietly by countless hands, unrecorded, their labor woven invisibly into the garments that warmed entire communities. If we close our eyes and imagine the medieval village at dusk, we might hear it. Beyond the barking of dogs, beyond the lowing of cattle, beyond the laughter of children settling into sleep, there is a softer sound, the faint whir of spindles, the patient twist of thread being born in firelight. The day might be ending, but spinning went on. It was not bound to the hours of daylight alone. As long as there was a fire, as long as there were hands willing, the spindle turned and thread grew. Night by night, it accumulated, patient as time itself. And so, the slow work of spinning stretched across centuries. It was never grand, never sudden, but it endured. Every cloak that wrapped a shepherd, every linen sheet that cooled a sleeper, every woven cloth that covered a table began here, in the turning of a spindle, in the quiet twisting of fibers into thread. It was humble work, almost invisible in its smallness, yet it carried the weight of survival. To spin was to join past to future, to take what nature offered and prepare it for use, to carry forward the knowledge of countless generations. It was slow, yes, but in its slowness lay its strength, its patience, its endurance. Tonight, as we let our minds wander back through those quiet cottages and summer doorways, we can feel something of its calm. The spindle still turns in our imagination, the thread still grows, and the gentle rhythm of spinning, soft and unhurried, continues on, a memory of patience woven into the very fabric of time. The loom was not a small thing. In many medieval cottages, it stood like a silent giant, its wooden frame filling an entire corner of the room, its beams so broad and heavy that they seemed part of the building itself. It was not a tool that could be set aside or stored easily. Once built, it remained where it was, year after year, season after season, an immovable presence that shaped the very arrangement of furniture and life around it. To step into a weaver's home was to notice the loom almost immediately. It drew the eye as a hearth does, not because of flame but because of size. Its upright posts, its crossbeams, its taut warp threads waiting in patient silence, all of it lent a sense of steady endurance to the room. It was as though the loom breathed alongside the family, a companion as constant as the fire in the hearth or the roof above their heads. Setting up the loom was itself a long act of devotion. Before weaving could begin, the warp had to be prepared, thread by thread, stretched carefully across the frame. This was not a task of minutes or hours, but of days. 100, even 200 threads might be needed, each measured, aligned, and tied into place. The weaver stood before the loom like a conductor arranging an unseen orchestra, each thread a voice waiting to be called into song. Mistakes could not be rushed past, for one crossed or tangled thread might spoil the pattern of the entire cloth. Patience was not just helpful, it was required. In this slow preparation, the loom revealed its nature, not a tool of speed, but of rhythm, of steady, careful progress. Once the warp was tied, the loom changed character. It was no longer silent wood, but a stage of sound and motion. The shuttle began to pass back and forth, carrying its weft thread across the waiting warp. With each throw, the beater came down, pressing the new line of thread into place. The sound was distinctive, a soft thump, a wooden creak, the faint whisper of fiber meeting fiber. It was a rhythm that repeated endlessly, so constant that it became part of the household's atmosphere. To sit in the cottage was to hear it, like the ticking of a clock or the crackling of the hearth. Over time, families grew accustomed to it, so that the loom's music blended with daily life, the barking of dogs, the cooing of doves in the rafters, the bubbling of a pot on the fire. The loom's presence changed the very feeling of the home. Children played beneath its frame, weaving in and out of its sturdy legs. Cats sometimes curled in the baskets of wool left nearby, lulled by the steady thump and hush of weaving. Men mended tools on benches not far from it, while women moved back and forth, spinning more thread, cooking meals, tending to children, all while the loom went on with its patient rhythm. It was not just a tool in the house. It was part of the family's life, part of its soundscape, its daily pattern, its memory. The loom demanded space, but it also gave something in return. It gave cloth, the most essential of household goods. Without cloth, there could be no warm garments for winter, no sheets for beds, no sacks for carrying grain, no sails for fishing boats. Cloth was life, and the loom was the bridge between raw thread and useful fabric. Every garment worn by a family, every blanket spread across a bed, carried with it the hours of work done in that corner of the home. It meant that the loom, though large and immovable, was not resented. Instead, it was respected, its size accepted because its gifts were so necessary. To watch a weaver at work was to witness a kind of quiet dance. The shuttle slipped from hand to hand, the feet pressed the treadles below, the heddles lifted threads in response, and the weft slid into place. Each movement was small, but together they created a flow as fluid as breathing. The weaver leaned forward, reached across, pressed down, and drew back, over and over, until the pattern of cloth appeared line by line. Hours passed in this motion, the loom marking time in its own way. Outside, seasons might shift, clouds drift across the sky, or frost gather on the fields. Inside, the loom remained steady, always working toward its quiet goal, a roll of finished fabric wound slowly upon its beam. The loom was sometimes compared to the bones of the house itself. Its uprights were like posts, its crossbeams like rafters, its warp like the lines of thatch overhead. Just as the house sheltered the family, the loom produced the cloth that sheltered their bodies. Together, house and loom created the space where life unfolded. For a child growing up in a weaver's household, the loom must have seemed as permanent as the walls themselves. It stood there every day of their lives, looming quietly. Its beams darkened with smoke from the hearth, its wood worn smooth by touch. There was also something symbolic in the loom's presence. To weave was to bring order from many strands, to create unity from diversity. The warp threads stood in neat rows, side by side, like the members of a household or the neighbors of a village. Alone, they were fragile, but together, held in tension, they became strong. The weft thread moved among them, binding them into a whole, line by line, until a pattern emerged. In this way, the loom mirrored the life of the community itself. Many individuals bound together into a fabric of survival, strengthened by patience and persistence. Even when silent, the loom carried memory. A half-finished cloth might rest upon it overnight, waiting for the next day's labor. To enter the cottage, then, was to see time paused, work suspended, the threads caught mid-pattern as though holding their breath. In the morning, the rhythm would resume, and the fabric would grow once more. But in the stillness of night, the loom stood like a guardian, its presence filling the room with quiet weight. The work of the loom was never quick, yet its slowness was not wasted time. It was steady time, time that taught patience, time that echoed the pace of seasons and years. Just as the fields ripened slowly, just as sheep's wool grew thick over many months, so too did the cloth emerge slowly upon the loom. The family accepted this rhythm because it was the rhythm of life itself, slow, deliberate, unfolding only with care. In the end, when the cloth was finally cut from the loom, it was more than fabric. It was the accumulation of hours, of motions repeated without number, of patience stretched across days. Each piece bore within it the memory of the loom's rhythm, the sound of the shuttle, the thump of the beater, the creak of the frame. The loom itself remained, ready for the next warp, the next cloth, the next season. But the fabric went out into the world, carrying with it the quiet labor of the household giant who stood silently in the corner, year after year. And so the loom was never just a tool. It was a presence, a companion, a giant of wood and thread that shaped the life of the medieval home. Its voice was the rhythm of weaving, its gift was the fabric of survival, and its memory lives on in every fragment of cloth that once warmed the bodies of those who worked, dreamed, and slept beneath its watchful frame. Color in the Middle Ages was not a thing of sharp brilliance or sudden surprise. It was something that came slowly, coaxed from the earth itself, tended with care, and drawn out by patience. When we imagine medieval cloth, it is easy to think of dull browns and grays, of muted homespun garments without variation. Yet, in truth, colors did live in that world, colors born not of bottles or factories, but of roots dug from soil, of leaves plucked in their season, of bark stripped from trees, of minerals gathered from hillsides and streams. To walk through a medieval village was to see these colors quietly worn by the people, reds that leaned toward rust or rose, blues that were deep yet soft, browns as warm as autumn leaves, and yellows as pale as dried straw. They were not the shining hues of silks in far-off courts, but they were colors enough to brighten the days of ordinary folk, drawn from the same earth that fed them. The work of dyeing was both craft and patience. It began, like most things in that age, with gathering. In summer, the countryside yielded its store, madder roots dug carefully from the soil, their tangled fingers holding the promise of red, woad leaves crushed before they could wither, to yield a blue unlike any other. Walnut husks collected as they fell from trees in late autumn, staining the fingers dark as they were handled. Women and men who dyed cloth knew where to search, when to harvest, and how to store these gifts of the land. The process was not hurried, for the plants themselves kept their own time. Madder needed years of growth before its roots reached full strength. Woad required fields and careful tending, as it was planted, cut, fermented, and pressed into balls for later use. Even walnut husks, though they fell freely, had to be gathered in their season, lest the rain spoil them. In this way, the palette of a village followed the rhythm of nature itself. Once gathered, the colors were coaxed into fabric by fire and water. In small courtyards, or in the low outbuildings behind cottages, stood dye vats. These were not grand structures, but simple tubs or iron cauldrons set over slow fires. Into these vessels, water was poured and heated until it steamed gently, filling the air with a mist that carried the faint sense of earth and smoke. The dyer would then add the chosen plant: chopped madder roots, fresh or dried woad, crushed, walnut husks, onion skins, birch leaves, or any of a dozen other humble sources. Slowly, as the water simmered, the color leached out, turning the liquid into a pool of pigment. The smell was not unpleasant, though it was strong, earthy, smoky, a little sour, sometimes faintly sweet. For neighbors, it was a familiar scent, one that spoke of cloth in the making, of garments soon to be dyed, the fibers to be colored. Wool, linen, sometimes even silk in rare cases, had to be prepared first. They were washed, to rid them of oils or dirt that might block the absorption of dye. Sometimes they were treated with mordants, substances like alum or iron, which helped fix the color to the fibers and change the final shade. Mordants were like unseen helpers, invisible in the finished cloth, yet essential in ensuring that the color endured through wear and washing. Wool especially took dye well, for it drank up pigment into its very fibers, holding it with a warmth and depth that linen could not always match. The moment came when the fibers were lowered into the vat. Slowly, the skeins of yarn or lengths of cloth were submerged, stirred gently with long wooden rods, and left to rest in the colored water. Time was essential. The fibers could not be rushed. They soaked, sometimes for hours, turning from pale to tinted, then deeper still, as if the liquid were breathing life into them. A skein of wool might enter the vat pale as morning mist, and emerge the color of soft clay, or the hue of fading leaves, or the deep blue of a twilight sky. To watch the change was to witness transformation, the earth's own tones captured and bound into fabric. When the cloth was lifted out, dripping and steaming, the air filled with the mingled smell of wet wool and plant dye. The colors, when wet, often looked darker than they would when dried. The yarn would be hung over wooden poles, sometimes outside, in the open air, where the breeze could move through it, sometimes indoors by the fire, where warmth hastened the drying. The sight was a quiet wonder. Rows of skeins in shades of red, blue, brown, or yellow, swaying gently in the air, each one a thread of the land itself, drawn into the service of daily life. Among the most treasured dyes of medieval Europe was woad. From its humble green leaves came a blue that was both deep and enduring. The process, however, was neither simple nor swift. The leaves were harvested, crushed, and formed into balls, then left to ferment until they developed the power to color cloth. The fermentation was pungent, its smell notorious, but the result was worth it. A blue that clothed peasants and nobles alike, a color that marked guilds and banners, and that gave to everyday garments a quiet dignity. To wear blue was not to shout, but to whisper of steadiness, of calm, of ties to the fields and skies. Madder, too, was beloved. Its roots, once boiled, released reds that ranged from pink to rust, from rose to brick. Unlike the scarlet dyes that later came from distant lands, Madder's shades were soft, earthy, and enduring. They were the reds of tilled soil, of embers at dusk, of ripe berries. A cloak dyed with madder carried with it the warmth of the ground itself, as though the earth had lent its own blood to clothe its children. Walnut husks, more humble still, gave shades of brown and black. No special preparation was needed, only the gathering of fallen husks, their juices staining hands dark as ink. These browns were the colors of bark, of soil, of autumn fields. They were not glamorous, but they were reliable, and many a cloak or tunic bore their shades, blending the wearer with the land itself. Other plants contributed to the weaver's palette as well. Onion skins gave yellows, as did birch leaves, or weld. Lichen could produce gentle purples and greys. Each village had its knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, of what the local fields and hedgerows might yield. This knowledge was not written in books for most, but carried in memory, in the hands of mothers and daughters, of craftsmen and apprentices. The colors that emerged from these efforts were rarely bright or uniform. They were living colors, subtle, irregular, touched by variation. A skein dyed with madder might hold within it many shades, lighter here, darker there, depending on how the fibers absorbed the pigment. Cloth woven from such yarn was rich not because it was even, but because it was varied, its surface alive, with the quiet play of tones. These were not the loud colors of later ages, but whisper soft voices of the earth, woven into garments. To live in such a world was to wear the land upon one's shoulders. A man's cloak carried the brown of walnut husks gathered in autumn. A woman's gown bore the red of madder roots dug from spring soil. A child's tunic held the blue of woad, coaxed from fermenting leaves. Each color was a reminder of the fields, the seasons, the patient work of hands that had drawn pigment from the earth. In this way, clothing was not merely a covering, but a link, a bond between human life and the land that sustained it. Even in their muted palette, these colors carried meaning. Certain shades held associations: blue with loyalty, red with strength, green with fertility, brown with humility. In churches, colors were chosen with care for their symbolism. In guilds, certain hues marked belonging or rank. For peasants, the meanings were simpler, but still felt. Clothing dyed with care spoke of pride in work, of a household that tended its tasks with diligence. At dusk, when the day's work was done and the dye vats cooled, the smell lingered in the air, earthy, smoky, a little sweet. The courtyard might be quiet, save for the drip of water from drying skeins, the faint creak of poles bearing their weight. A passer-by would know, by scent and sight alike, that colors had been made there that day. And within the cottages, as garments were cut and sewn from the newly dyed cloth, families felt the comfort of warmth, of color, of the earth's own gift made wearable. The world of medieval dyeing was slow, patient, and deeply tied to the land. It was not about brilliance, but about endurance. The colors whispered, and in their whispers lay the voice of fields, of trees, of streams. Every cloak, every blanket, every tunic was a reminder of this quiet conversation between human hands and the earth itself. And so, when we imagine the Middle Ages, let us not see only grey or brown. Let us see the soft red of madder, the calm blue of woad, the earthy brown of walnut, the pale yellow of weld. Let us see these colors not as fleeting decoration, but as enduring companions, drawn from soil and plant, worn close to the skin, carrying with them the memory of land, season, and the slow patience of dye vats steaming gently in the courtyard of a cottage. The story of medieval weaving cannot be told without the turning of the seasons, for every thread was bound to the cycles of the year. The loom was not simply a tool that stood apart from weather and time. It was, instead, a quiet recorder of the year's passage, mirroring the chill of winter, the damp of spring, the warmth of summer, and the mists of autumn. The cloth that came forth was not only a covering for the body, but also a memory of the season in which it had been made. To hold a cloak or a tunic was to feel not only the fiber and dye, but the very breath of a particular time of year, frost in which the wool had been shorn, the rain that had watered the flax, the sunlight that had dried the skeins, or the hearth fire that had warmed the hands of the spinner. In this way, medieval fabric was a calendar as much as it was a garment. In winter, the need for cloth was greatest. The cold pressed against every wall and crept through every crack. Fires gave warmth, but they did not reach every corner of a cottage, and so people wrapped themselves in layers of wool. The wool was thick, coarse, and practical. Cloaks hung heavily from the shoulders, long enough to cover much of the body, and fastened at the neck with simple brooches or ties. Beneath them, tunics of wool or linen added another layer, while legs were wrapped in hose, sometimes pieced together from scraps of cloth. Winter garments were not meant for beauty, though the natural dyes gave them soft tones of brown, grey, or faded red. They were made to endure the wool thick enough to block wind, dense enough to hold body heat, heavy enough to turn snow into dampness rather than chill. To step outside into winter fields or forests, one did so not only with courage, but with cloth as a shield. The making of winter cloth required foresight. Wool from sheep shorn in spring or early summer was cleaned, spun, and woven throughout the year, with the thought always in mind of the coming cold. Families knew that a cloak begun too late might leave them exposed when frost arrived. In this way, weaving was tied to preparation. The rhythm of the loom in autumn was not only the rhythm of work, but the steady beat of survival, as families hurried to complete what they would need before snow fell. When spring came, the garments shifted. The air grew damp, the earth softened, and new shoots rose from the soil. Flax was sown in the fields, its tiny seeds scattered with hope. Soon, its pale blue blossoms would cover the land like a faint sky lying upon the earth. Wool was still worn, for spring nights could be cold, but lighter linens began to take their place. Linen was smooth against the skin, cool where wool was heavy, and it gave relief when the first warm days arrived. Children especially welcomed the feel of linen tunics, for their skin was often rubbed raw by the coarseness of wool. Spring cloth carried with it the freshness of the season. It was often newer, less worn, its fibers not yet stiffened by sweat or weather. The colors, though still muted, seemed brighter against the greening fields. A madder-red cloak catching the eye beside sprouting wheat, a woad blue tunic standing out against the pale blossoms of orchards. Garments were patched and mended in spring, too, as families took stock of what had survived winter. A tear in a sleeve, a worn hem, a missing fastening all were quietly repaired. With the same patience that sowed seeds and tended lambs, summer brought its own garments, light and loose. The sun grew warm upon the fields, and the labor of harvest demanded freedom of movement. Wool, in its heavier form, was set aside, though lighter woolens still served in the evenings or in sudden rains. Linen, however, became the cloth of choice. Its breathability made it the favored fabric for shirts, tunics and undergarments. A peasant bending over a field of grain often did so in a coarse linen shirt, its sleeves rolled high, its hem stained with soil and sweat. Children wore little more than short linen shifts, allowing them to play in the warmth without burden. Women, too, worked in lighter garments, their linen dresses belted simply, their heads covered with kerchiefs to shield from sun. The touch of linen in summer was as welcome as the shade of a tree. It held coolness when damp with sweat, and dried quickly when washed in streams. Though it did not insulate as wool did, it breathed with the body, allowing air to flow through. Its weave, the sound of linen snapping in the wind, when washed garments were hung to dry, was a familiar sound of summer villages. Pale garments, drying in rows, flapped like sails, brightening the yards of cottages. Autumn was the time of gathering, and with it came the need for sturdier garments once more. The harvest was long and demanding, and though the days could still be warm, evenings grew cold and mist settled in. Cloaks returned to shoulders, though often thrown loosely, ready to be cast aside in labor. Wool and linen together made up the layered clothing of the season, protecting from chill without burdening with too much heat. Autumn garments often showed signs of wear, for the year's work had taken its toll. Sleeves were patched with pieces of contrasting cloth, knees reinforced with extra layers, hems shortened when the fabric had frayed. Yet in these repairs lay a quiet beauty, for the garments bore the memory of the year's toil. For medieval people, cloth was not a matter of fashion alone, but of survival. To have enough was to live, to lack was to suffer. A cloak was not only warmth, but a shield against illness. A linen shift was not only comfort, but protection from rashes and sores. A pair of hose was not only covering, but guard against biting, cold. Every piece of fabric was valued, and none was wasted. Old garments were cut into smaller ones, large clothes passed down to children, scraps turned into patches or rags. Even worn-out wool could be felted into new material, pressed thick, to serve as padding or lining. In this way, the life of cloth was long, and each thread served as fully as it could before it was gone. Children grew up learning the language of fabric. They knew the coarseness of wool against skin in winter, the relief of smooth linen in summer, the heavy drape of cloaks for journeys, the scratch of old patched garments, and the rare softness of finer cloth. For them, clothing was not abstract, it was tangible, a teacher of the seasons, a reminder of the family's labor, and a measure of comfort or hardship. To hold a cloak was to know whether the household was well prepared or struggling. To feel the thinness of a tunic was to sense the passing of time and the wearing away of resources. The cycle of seasons and cloth was unbroken. Each year, sheep grew their fleece again, flax was sown again, dyers filled their vats again, and weavers bent over their looms once more. What had been worn and worn through was replaced, thread by thread, season by season. In this way, cloth was as much a rhythm of life as the planting of fields or the ringing of church bells. It marked the passage of time, wrapped the body in the memory of each season, and gave to daily life a fabric both literal and symbolic. At the end of the year, as winter drew in once more, families sat by their hearths wrapped in woolen cloaks and linen shifts, feeling the textures of all that had been made across the months, the crackle of the fire, the creak of the loom, the whisper of wind outside the walls. All were met with the quiet comfort of cloth. Each season had given its gift, and each gift had been worn, valued, and remembered. Cloth, in medieval life, was more than material. It was the cycle of the seasons themselves, woven into forms that could be touched, worn, and passed on. To touch the fabric was to feel the turn of the year, the frost and thaw, the growth and harvest, the light and dark. It was the memory of fields, flocks, and firesides, carried close against the skin. In the quiet world of medieval weaving, beauty often whispered instead of shouted. Much of the cloth worn by villagers was plain woven in muted tones of undyed wool or softly colored linen. Yet plainness did not mean absence of grace. Within the folds of everyday garments, within the blankets folded on wooden chests, and within the cloaks hung near hearthside walls, there existed quiet touches of pattern, simple and enduring. These patterns were not extravagant displays reserved for kings and nobles. They were not embroidered with gold thread or laden with jewels. Instead, they were woven directly into the fabric itself, small stripes, soft checks, repeating diamonds, or narrow bands of color along the edges. They were patterns made by hands that valued patience, steadiness, and the quiet pride of turning necessity into art. A weaver at her loom might spend long hours working plain threads back and forth, the shuttle carrying wool or flax through the warp in a rhythm as calm as breathing. Yet even in such simplicity, the human desire for beauty found its way. At the edge of a cloak, a stripe of deeper brown might appear, subtle against the natural wool. In a tunic, a band of pale blue might interrupt the cream of the fabric, giving a soft liveliness to the garment. A blanket might carry a faint checkered design, not loud, but visible when held to the light. These touches were small, but they carried meaning. They were a way of saying that even in modest homes, even in lives ruled by labor, there was still room for grace. Patterns in cloth often carried memory. A grandmother might weave a motif she herself had learned from her own mother, passing it down through the threads as surely as she passed down stories by the fireside. These designs were not written on parchment or preserved in books. They were stored in the memory of hands, in the habit of setting threads in certain ways. A village might come to be known for particular styles, so that cloth woven there carried a character that marked its place of origin. In this way, patterns were not just decoration, they were identity. To wear them was to carry a fragment of home. The beauty of these patterns lay not in grandeur but in restraint. The weaver had little time to spare for extravagant designs, for her labor was needed to produce cloth that would clothe her family and neighbors. But within the discipline of her work, she found small spaces to add flourish. A single stripe across the hem, a diamond repeated every few inches, or a band of alternating colors gave quiet joy. The satisfaction was not only in the appearance but in the making. The rhythm of weaving was calm, yet to set a pattern required thought, intention, and skill. To guide the threads into a repeating design was to transform a simple necessity into something touched by artistry. In households where wealth was scarce, these patterns became treasures. When garments were patched, the patterned pieces were often preserved with care, sewn into new clothing so that their beauty might not be lost. Children grew up recognizing these motifs, associating them with the warmth of their mother's hands or the safety of their homes. When a cloak was folded and placed into a chest for the summer, its edge of colored bands would be seen again in autumn, stirring memories of the year before. Thus, patterns carried not only aesthetic value but emotional weight. They tied together moments of life across seasons and years. Even when cloth wore thin, the designs lingered. A stripe might fade, but traces of color remained, softened by time and washing. A motif might fray, yet its outline persisted, like the memory of a song. Half remembered in this way, medieval cloth aged gracefully, its beauty weathered but enduring. The quiet dignity of worn patterns spoke of years of use, of care given, and of the patient labor that had first shaped them. Weaving patterns was also a way of joining past and future. A girl might learn at her mother's side how to set the warp for a striped design, her small hands assisting in the slow threading of hundreds of strings. At first, she watched, then she imitated, until the knowledge became her own. Later, as she grew into her own work, she carried that knowledge forward, teaching it in turn to others. The continuity of pattern was thus like the continuity of song or story. Each generation repeated the old motifs, sometimes adding small changes of their own, sometimes keeping them exactly as they had been. Through this, the fabric of history was literally woven into the fabric of daily life. The choice of pattern was often shaped by material. Wool, with its natural colors of cream, brown, gray, and black, lent itself to stripes or checks formed simply by alternating shades. A loom might hold threads of light and dark, and the shuttle could carry contrasting colors, creating a rhythm of alternating bands. Linen, paler and smoother, offered a surface for finer designs. Though it was more difficult to dye, the interplay of wool and linen gave variation, and when dyes were available, deeper tones of blue, red, or green could be added to enrich the designs. But even without dyes, the natural hues of fibers created beauty. The pattern lay not in extravagance, but in the harmony of what was at hand. It is easy to imagine the weaver pausing in her work, the shuttle resting for a moment, her eyes tracing the growing fabric. She would see the design emerging slowly, inch by inch, like the unfolding of a story. The satisfaction of watching a motif take shape was quiet but profound, for in that moment, necessity and creativity were united. The cloth would warm and clothe, but it would also please the eye and gladden the heart. Patterns had symbolic value as well. Some designs were linked to protection, the repetition of a cross or diamond serving as a sign of safety. Others were simply pleasing to the eye, a rhythm of line and space that echoed the natural world, the furrows of a plowed field, the ripples of water, the branches of a tree. In this way, woven designs reflected the world around the weaver, grounding her work in the land and life she knew. Though much of medieval cloth was destined for hard use, it was never without these touches of grace. A peasant might wear a tunic patched in many places, yet the edge of its sleeve carried a stripe woven decades earlier, a mark of care and pride. A blanket laid across a straw bed might be rough to the touch, yet its faint checkered design spoke of patient artistry. These small beauties were not hidden from those who used them daily. They were part of life, as natural as the shapes of fields or the songs sung at harvest. The quiet beauty of patterns also offered comfort. In a world where life was often harsh and uncertain, where illness, hunger, or loss were never far away, these small details gave a sense of order and peace. To see a repeating motif was to see something steady, unchanging, and reliable. It was a reminder that while much in life could not be controlled, the hands could still create beauty from thread and fiber. At night, when garments were folded away and looms stood silent, these patterns rested quietly, waiting to be seen again. A cloak laid across a bench, its colored edge, just visible in firelight, reminded the household of the weaver's patient labor. A folded sheet of linen, with faint stripes along its edge, lay cool against wooden chests, ready to be spread across beds when warmth was needed. The beauty of these patterns was not loud. It was calm, enduring, and always present. Thus, in the medieval world, cloth was more than covering. It was memory, tradition, and quiet artistry. The simple designs woven into its threads were like whispers across generations, binding families, villages, and years together. They were proof that even in modest households, even in lives of labor and simplicity, the human impulse toward beauty was never absent. It was always there, quiet but strong, woven patiently into the fabric of life. In the life of a medieval weaver, most days passed in quiet rhythm, the hum of the loom, the whisper of the shuttle, the creak of wooden beams. Yet from time to time, that quiet gave way to another rhythm, the slow, steady murmur of the marketplace. On these days, the threads spun and woven in the dim light of cottages stepped out into the brightness of the wider world. Markets were the moments when patient labor, stored in folded cloth and bundled wool, met exchange, trade, and community. The village market was no sudden affair. It was as much a part of the yearly cycle as harvest, lambing, or the sowing of seed. Set days were agreed upon long before, and when they arrived, they drew people from near and far. At dawn, before the cock crowed a second time, villagers were already on the move. Some carried bolts of cloth, wrapped carefully in linen, or bound with cords of hemp. Others brought skeins of spun yarn, soft bundles of fleece, or small rolls of dyed fabric. Families rose early to help, for the carrying of goods was heavy, and the path to market was often long. The journey itself was part of the day, across meadows still wet with dew, through woods where birds were only just beginning to stir. The people made their way, their arms laden with the fruits of quiet work. The rhythm of their steps echoed the rhythm of their weaving, slow, steady, persistent. Along the roads, they were joined by others, farmers with baskets of eggs, potters with glazed wares, shepherds with sheep to sell. The closer they came to the market square, the louder the hum became, until finally they entered a place alive with gentle sound. The market did not roar like a storm. It was a softer music, a weaving together of voices, footsteps, and movement. Merchants called in steady tones, offering their goods. Coins clinked in small purses, exchanged with care, for each one carried weight. Cloth was unrolled across tables, its threads catching the light of the morning sun. Hands reached out to feel the texture, to judge the weight of linen, the warmth of wool, the rustle of fabric, the murmur of barter, the quiet laughter of neighbors. Meeting again, these were the sounds of the market. At the heart of these gatherings lay cloth, for it was both necessity and treasure. A bolt of sturdy wool might clothe a family for a winter. A fine piece of linen might serve as bridal wear, or become the tablecloth laid out on holy days. To bring cloth to market was to bring hours upon hours of labor, every piece representing the patient time of spinning, dyeing, and weaving. Buyers knew this, and their touch was reverent. They did not simply see fabric, they saw the warmth of winters to come, the coverings for their children, the dignity of garments to wear in church. Over time, markets gave birth to cloth halls, quieter buildings where the trade of fabric could take place under shelter. In towns that grew prosperous from weaving, such halls became the beating heart of commerce. Their walls were thick, their roofs high, and their rows of stalls stretched in careful order. Within them, bolts of cloth were stacked in neat piles, filling the air with the faint smell of wool and dye. The hall's space echoed with footsteps on stone floors, voices carrying more softly than in the open air, but no less steadily. Here, cloth met not only villagers but merchants from other towns, sometimes from faraway lands. In these halls, the world of the weaver expanded. A piece of linen woven in a cottage by the hearth might find its way into the hands of a merchant bound for another country. A woolen cloak woven in a small town might end up in the wardrobe of a distant noble. The cloth hall was a bridge between the small world of the household and the great web of trade that stretched across Europe. Yet even in this, the pace was never hurried. Transactions unfolded slowly, with weighing, measuring, and careful negotiation. The calm patience of weaving carried into the marketplace itself. For the villagers, market day was not only business, it was also community. Here they met neighbors they might not have seen for weeks. Here news was exchanged, marriages arranged, and friendships renewed. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, eager to see the toys and sweets sold at stalls. Old men sat near doorways, watching the flow of life. The market was as much about presence as about trade. To stand amid the hum was to feel the pulse of the village itself. The cloth, once sold, entered a new rhythm. Some buyers purchased to use directly. A farmer's wife might buy a length of undyed wool to cut into tunics for her children. A traveling merchant might buy colored cloth to sell at another fair. A tailor in town might buy several bolts, planning to cut them into garments for those who could pay for finer work. In each case, the cloth continued its journey, moving from loom to market to household, gathering new meaning at every step. The marketplace itself was shaped by the rhythm of the seasons. In summer, it was bright and dusty, with sunlight falling across stalls and the air filled with the smell of warm bread and fresh herbs. In winter, it was darker, with breath rising in clouds and merchants warming their hands over small braziers. Each season carried its own sounds, scents, and colors, yet the market endured, steady as the passing of the year. For the weaver, the memory of market day lingered long after the goods were sold. Back in the cottage, at the loom, she remembered the feel of hands testing her cloth, the quiet words of praise, the careful exchange of coins. These memories gave new life to the work, for weaving was not only labor done in solitude, it was part of a larger web, a shared cycle in which cloth became both survival and connection. Thus, markets and cloth halls stood as thresholds. On one side was the quiet, private world of weaving, the patient labor of threads and hands. On the other side was the shared world of trade, where those same threads joined the fabric of community. Neither world could exist without the other. Without weaving, the market would have nothing to sell. Without the market, weaving would remain unseen, its beauty folded away in dark cottages. Together, they formed a rhythm as steady as breath. The loom at home, the stall in the market, the hall in the town, and back again. And so, amid the clink of coins and the rustle of cloth, amid the hum of voices and the smell of bread and wool, the weaver's work found its place in the great cycle of medieval life. It was quiet, enduring, and never hurried. It was the meeting of patient labor with community need, the moment when cloth left the loom and entered the wider world, carrying with it the memory of fields, flocks, and the gentle persistence of hands. In the quiet rhythm of medieval life, weaving was not only the work of cottages and hearths. In towns, where streets wound closely together and church towers rose above wooden roofs, weaving found a different shape, one woven not only in cloth, but in community. Here, the loom did not stand alone in a single household. Instead, it stood among many, its presence bound into a larger pattern, the guild. Guilds were associations of craftsmen, and though their name carried the sound of authority, their order was gentle, steady, and meant to preserve rather than to command. For weavers, the guild was both shelter and structure. It gathered those who worked at looms, those who spun, dyed, and sold cloth, into a single body with shared rules and shared hopes. Within its halls, apprentices were trained, masters were honored, and standards were kept with care. The life of a weaver in a guild town was shaped by this order. From the moment an apprentice stepped into a master's workshop, he entered not only a place of labor, but a lineage. Training did not begin with lofty instruction, but with small, humble tasks. The boy, or sometimes the girl, swept the floor, fetched water, or wound the spun yarn. Day after day, his eyes watched the loom, his ears grew accustomed to the creak of beams and the hush of the shuttle. Slowly, he learned the language of weaving, not through books, but through patient repetition. Guided by the steady hands of his master, the guild hall itself was a place of quiet authority. Built often of timber and stone, its walls held the weight of years. Candles burned steadily in iron holders, their flames flickering against beams darkened by smoke. Benches lined the room, and at the center stood a long table where masters sat to discuss matters of the craft. Records were kept carefully, written in a slow hand upon parchment, each letter a mark of permanence. Rules were not spoken in haste, but read aloud with measured tone, so that all could hear and understand. These rules did not exist to burden, they were meant to guard both craftsmen and their craft. They declared, for instance, that cloth must be woven to certain measures, that threads must be sound, and that dyes must hold their color. Such standards protected the reputation of the guild, but they also protected the buyer, ensuring that trust would never be broken. In this way, guilds created a fabric of fairness, as carefully woven as the cloths made by their members. Apprentices, after years of training, passed slowly into the rank of journeymen. This word itself suggested movement, men who journeyed from town to town, offering their skill in return for work. With a bundle of clothes, a small purse of coins, and tools carefully kept, the journeyman traveled, seeking masters who would employ him. Each new town, each new loom, added to his knowledge, and in every guild hall he found a familiar order, the same slow rituals, the same care for quality, the same fellowship of craftsmen. For those who proved themselves, mastery awaited. To become a master weaver was no sudden leap, but the culmination of years of patient labor. Often, the final step required the creation of a masterpiece, a piece of cloth woven to demonstrate skill beyond question. This work was not extravagant, but precise, the threads even, the colors true, the pattern harmonious. Presented before the guild, it was judged with calm deliberation. If accepted, the journeyman was welcomed into the company of masters, gaining not only recognition, but the right to take apprentices of his own. Thus, the flow of knowledge moved steadily forward, from elder hands to younger, like a river that never ceased. Beyond training, the guild served as a quiet guardian of its members' lives. When illness struck, or when a craftsman grew too old to work, the guild offered help. Coins were gathered from many hands to support a widow or orphan. Meals were shared in times of need. In this way, the guild was more than a professional body, it was a family, a fabric of mutual care. Its strength lay not in loud command, but in gentle constancy. The rhythm of the guild was marked by meetings, festivals, and rituals. On certain days of the year, members gathered in procession, carrying banners embroidered with symbols of their craft. Candles were lit in the town church, prayers offered for the souls of departed members. Feasts followed, with long tables set. In the guild hall, where bread, meat, and ale were shared in steady abundance, these were not wild celebrations, but quiet affirmations of unity. As the cups were lifted, as songs were sung in measured tones, each weaver felt himself part of something larger than his own loom. The influence of the guild stretched into the very streets of the town. Cloth was measured and sealed under its watchful eye. Markets were regulated, prices agreed upon, disputes settled with calm authority. Even the dyeing vats and fulling mills fell under its care, ensuring that no step in the making of cloth fell short of honesty. To live and work in a guild town was to dwell within a gentle order, where each thread was accounted for, each hand respected. And yet, for all its rules and structure, the guild was never cold. It was warmed by the steady presence of generations. The apprentice who once swept the floor became the master who guided others. The journeyman who once wandered became the elder who sat at the long table, his voice calm, his memory long. Candles burned in the hall as they had for centuries, their smoke carrying upward like a prayer. Parchment records accumulated slowly, preserving the names of men whose hands had woven for towns now long changed. The guild's life was measured not in days, but in lifetimes, each one folded gently into the next. For the weaver, this order was both anchor and horizon. At the loom, alone with the rhythm of the shuttle, he felt the solitude of his craft. But in the hall, surrounded by fellow craftsmen, he felt its fellowship. The guild bound together the private and the public, the household and the town, the present and the future. Its order was not loud or forceful, but quiet, steady, and enduring like the threads it guarded. And so, amid the flicker of candles, the careful scratch of quills, the low murmur of voices, the guild carried on. It was the keeper of the craft, the guardian of trust, the gentle hand that ensured weaving did not fade, but flowed onward, generation by generation, like an unbroken thread. In the medieval world, cloth was never just a covering for the body. It was a language, a quiet symbol, and a gentle companion in every stage of life. From the cradle to the grave, woven textiles appeared not only as garments or blankets, but as silent witnesses to human joy and sorrow. Their presence marked beginnings, transitions, and endings, carrying meaning beyond warmth, beyond modesty. They were part of ritual, part of memory, and part of the slow rhythm of human passage through time. At the start of life, a newborn child was received not into bare air, but into the folds of cloth. Often it was linen, newly spun and freshly washed, its smoothness soft against tender skin. Mothers prepared such wrappings with care, sometimes saving the finest piece from their own weaving for this moment. In that first swaddling, the infant was welcomed into both the family and the wider world, cocooned in fabric that carried the scent of hearth and home. The act was simple, but it held meaning. The first embrace of cloth mirrored the embrace of the community itself. As the child grew, cloth continued to accompany each step. Baptisms often saw the baby in a small white garment, pure and unmarked, a sign of innocence. This white linen, plain though it was, became a garment of hope. In some places, the cloth was kept afterward, folded carefully into a chest, waiting to be repurposed for other rituals later in life. A piece of it might one day become part of a wedding veil or even a burial shroud. In this way, one thread was stretched across an entire life, binding its chapters together. When childhood turned toward youth, the garments changed. At certain ages, boys received their first tunic of adult style, or girls their first gown with longer hems. These transitions were not always marked by formal ceremonies, but the shift in clothing carried a quiet signal. The child was now ready to take on new tasks, to shoulder new responsibilities. Families took pride in this, and the new garments, often freshly dyed or carefully stitched, were not merely practical, they were celebratory. A sleeve sewn with care, a hem embroidered with a small pattern, spoke volumes of parental love and of hopes for the future. Marriage, perhaps the most celebrated moment of life, was inseparable from cloth. In villages, brides often wore garments woven within their own households, made by mothers, sisters, or even by their own hands if they had skill enough. The cloth itself carried the story of family labor, wool shorn from familiar sheep, flax grown in nearby fields, dye brewed from local plants. To wear such a garment on the wedding day was to wrap oneself not only in fabric, but in the memory of fields, seasons, and kinship. In towns and among wealthier families, weddings might be marked by finer displays. Colored cloths were hung across streets, banners waved from windows, and processions saw garments richer in hue than ordinary days allowed. Yet even here the meaning was steady and clear. Cloth was celebration. It announced union not with words, but with brightness and form. A length of woven fabric became both stage and witness, stretching across the moment like a blessing. After marriage, cloth continued to shape family life. Household chests were filled with linens, some for daily use, some for moments yet to come. A well-prepared bride often brought such a chest as part of her dowry, stocked with folded cloths, woven towels, and blankets. These were not simply objects of comfort, but symbols of her skill, patience, and readiness to nurture a new household. To lift the lid of such a chest was to glimpse the weaving of both fabric and future. Cloth also stood at the thresholds of death. When life reached its end, garments were prepared with the same care given at its beginning. Shrouds of plain linen, often undyed, wrapped the body. There was humility in this choice. Even those who had worn fine garments in life were brought to rest in simple folds of fabric. The whiteness, the plainness, carried meaning. It spoke of return, of rest, of the equal silence that awaited all. Families placed great importance on preparing these shrouds, for they were the last gift given to the departed. Beyond the personal moments of birth, marriage, and death, cloth marked the communal rhythms of festivals and feasts. In villages, when holy days approached, homes were swept, hearths were brightened, and cloths were brought out. Tables were covered with fresh linen, streets hung with banners, and churches dressed in colored fabrics that shifted the entire atmosphere of stone and wood into one of reverence and joy. These displays were not grand in scale, but they were deeply felt. They signaled that ordinary time had given way to sacred time. Processions, too, were carried on cloth. Banners embroidered with saints, lined with bright borders, swayed above the heads of villagers as they walked together through fields and streets. The very act of carrying such banners transformed them from mere textiles into symbols of devotion. A piece of cloth became a prayer, visible to all. Even the smallest village might have a banner kept carefully in the church, brought out only a few times a year, each stitch a memory of community effort. Seasonal festivals often called for special garments as well. On midwinter nights, when fires burned long, cloaks of heavy wool wrapped families close. At midsummer, lighter fabrics, dyed in colors that mirrored the season, gave brightness to dancing and celebration. In each festival, the choice of fabric was not accidental, but part of the ritual itself. The weight, the hue, the texture contributed to the feeling of the day. In times of sorrow, too, cloth spoke quietly. Families mourning a loved one might wear darker garments, or simpler ones, their plainness itself a sign of grief. Veils were drawn over faces, cloaks worn longer. The absence of color was as eloquent as its presence. Just as bright fabrics marked joy, subdued ones marked loss, creating a language of cloth that required no words. Cloth also preserved memory. Garments worn at significant events were sometimes kept, folded into chests as keepsakes. A wedding tunic, though too worn for further use, might remain in storage for decades, a reminder of vows once spoken. A child's first swaddling cloth might be patched into a quilt, keeping its presence alive through new generations. In this way, fabric carried memory not only through its patterns, but through its very fibers, which outlived the moment of their making. What is striking is how deeply cloth wove itself into both the private and public spheres. It was not reserved for rare moments alone, nor was it only the concern of the wealthy. Every family, every village, used cloth to mark life's passages. Its value lay not in luxury, but in meaning. A plain piece of linen could carry more significance than the richest velvet, because it was tied to memory, to ritual, to the rhythm of life itself. Thus, to live in the Middle Ages was to live surrounded by cloth, not only in the garments worn each day, but in the rituals that shaped existence. It wrapped the newborn, clothed the bride, carried the deceased, and adorned the festivals. It hung in churches, waved in processions, covered tables, and lay folded in chests. It was always there, silent yet eloquent, humble yet essential. Cloth was not merely part of life, it was life's companion, its witness, its gentle mirror. And when the day's ceremonies ended, when the festivals quieted, and when the mourners went home, the cloth was folded again, returned to its place in the chest, ready to wait for the next occasion. In its silence, it held memory. In its folds, it carried the weight of countless human moments, woven not only in thread, but in time. The loom may have been the towering centerpiece of a cottage, but it was never alone. Surrounding it were smaller companions, modest in shape yet essential in purpose, that seemed to whisper rather than shout, their presence felt in the slow rhythm of weaving life. These were not instruments of clamor or urgency. Instead, they were companions of wood and bone, iron and thread, smoothed by countless touches, quiet in their service, steady in their loyalty. In the world of medieval weaving, such tools formed an unbroken circle of care around the loom, extending its work into every corner of the weaver's day. Imagine a small chest near the hearth, its lid lifting to reveal spindles, combs, and heddles laid side by side. Each was shaped by a craftsman's hand, carved from oak, ash, or sometimes the hollow strength of bone. None were elaborate. Their beauty came not from ornament but from where the sheen of polished handles, the softened edges where fingers had rested, Over years of use, they grew warmer to the touch, almost as though they held the memory of their labor. These were not possessions, to be quickly replaced. They endured, handed from one generation to another, the marks of age deepening their character. The spindle was perhaps the most intimate of all. It was small enough to be carried anywhere, slipped into a pocket of apron or satchel, its whirling dance ready to begin at any moment. Spindles turned flax and wool into thread, their motion simple yet endless. When released, they spun downward with a soft hum, their weight pulling fibers into length until the spinner caught them again. To watch a spindle was to see patience given form. Its whisper was the sound of thread being born, line by line, twist by twist, as steady as breath. Heddles, by contrast, lived within the loom itself. They were narrow strips of wood, bone, or even thread, each pierced with an eye through which the warp threads passed. Their role was modest yet vital, to lift and separate, to open a path for the shuttle's journey. Without heddles, weaving would stumble. With them, the loom sang in order, its movements flowing as smoothly as a river. Their sound was not loud, only the gentle tap of wood against wood, a rhythm so steady that it faded into the background of cottage life. Children grew up hearing it as naturally as the crackle of fire or the cooing of doves outside. Then there were the shuttles, small boats of wood that carried thread across the warp. Smooth from repeated passage, they glided in and out like swallows through a barn door. The weaver's hand pushed them forward, caught them again, and returned them in endless back and forth motion. Each shuttle bore its own weight, shaped carefully to fit the fingers. Some were carved with initials or small marks of ownership, tokens of pride in a craft that valued not extravagance, but steadiness. The sound of a shuttle striking gently against the loom's frame was part of the music of weaving, soft, regular, reassuring. Combs, or carders, prepared fibers before the spinning began, made from wooden frames lined with rows of teeth, sometimes iron. Sometimes stiffened bristles, they worked in pairs, drawing through fleece or flax to untangle and align the strands. The motion was deliberate, back and forth, a rasp softened by the texture of wool. It was not a harsh sound, but a steady brushing, like the grooming of an animal. Through these tools, raw fleece became a smooth cloud, ready to be drawn into thread. The weaver's world depended on such preparation, though the task was unseparated, known only to those who performed it with quiet diligence. Reels and winding frames gathered the spun thread, keeping it from tangling, stretching it into skeins. Their turning arms moved slowly, round and round, creaking softly as wood rubbed against wood. These reels were often tall enough to stand on the cottage floor, their presence familiar yet unobtrusive. Watching them spin could lull the mind into calm, the slow circling motion echoing the larger circles of life, seasons, festivals, years, passing quietly. All these tools shared a certain gentleness. Unlike the clanging of blacksmiths or the rumble of mill wheels, weaving tools spoke in whispers. Their sounds blended with the cottage environment, the bubbling of stew in the pot, the scratching of hens in the yard, the murmur of wind against shutters. They did not intrude. They accompanied. To live among them was to inhabit a world of soft industry, where creation grew from patience rather than force. The materials of these tools mattered as much as their form. Wood was the most common, chosen from local forests. Oak, ash, and beech were valued for strength, while softer woods like willow were used for lighter parts. Bone, too, was shaped into smooth handles and spindle whorls, its pale color shining against darker fibers. In towns, wealthier weavers might own tools with touches of brass or iron, though even these were crafted with restraint. Nothing was wasted. Broken tools were repaired, handles re-smoothed, teeth replaced. The intimacy between weaver and tool grew deeper with every mended crack, every polished corner. Apprentices learned first, not the loom, but these smaller instruments. A master weaver would hand a boy or girl a spindle, guiding their fingers to twist the fibers, teaching them to listen to the spindle's hum. Only when they could spin thread steady and fine were they introduced to heddles and shuttles. The tools, in this way, became teachers themselves, shaping patience and precision long before a student touched the full loom. The relationship between weaver and tool was one of quiet companionship. Tools required corroiling of wood, careful storage away from damp, wrapping in cloth to prevent dust. In return, they gave decades of service. A spindle might spin thread for both grandmother, and granddaughter, a shuttle might carry yarn across warp after warp for half a century. They were not disposable, not fleeting. They grew old alongside the families who used them, each nick and scratch recording a chapter of shared life. In festivals, tools sometimes appeared in symbolic form. Processions might carry banners showing spindles or looms, emblems of the craft's dignity. Guilds displayed great carved shuttles or reels as signs of their trade. Yet in daily life, tools remained humble, rarely celebrated. Their whisper was enough. They did not need to be seen. Their presence was felt in every garment worn, every blanket laid across a bed, every sail raised on a ship. The soundscape of a weaving household was therefore one of layered whispers. The hiss of combs, the hum of spindle, the tap of heddle, the glide of shuttle. Together they formed a music, both domestic and enduring. To fall asleep near such sounds was to be lulled into dreams threaded with patience and care. To wake and hear them begin again was to know that life continued steadily, quietly, and with purpose. In this way, the whisper of tools was the whisper of life itself. They embodied the medieval rhythm, not hurried, not idle, but balanced, enduring, connected to hand, hearth, and home. Even centuries later, their presence can still be imagined, small companions in wood and bone, waiting in the shadows of cottages, carrying forward the humble yet beautiful work of weaving. When we think of weaving in the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine the loom itself, tall beams of wood, a frame that held hundreds of threads, the shuttle passing back and forth. Yet the loom did not exist in isolation. It belonged to a room, to a household, to a small corner of life where people lived, breathed, cooked, rested, and worked. And within that space, the presence of windows, those modest openings to the world beyond, played a quiet but vital role. Windows of light and air shaped the weaver's day, softening the threads of labor with glimpses of sky and scent, with the shifting colors of daylight, and with the calm reminder that work was always joined to the life of the village beyond the walls. Most cottages had only a few small windows, and these were not like our modern panes of clear glass. Glass, in fact, was rare and precious, often reserved for churches, monasteries, or the homes of wealthy merchants. A village weaver's cottage was more likely to have shutters made of wood, or thin coverings of oiled cloth that let some brightness filter through while keeping out the worst of the wind. When shutters were swung open, daylight poured in, uneven and soft, striking the loom and the threads in ways that changed hour by hour. Mornings brought a clear, pale glow. Afternoons filled the room with warmer tones. Evenings drew long shadows across the beams. These changes mattered deeply, for weaving was work of precision, and a well-lit window could mean the difference between smooth progress and stumbling error. Imagine entering such a cottage on a summer's morning. The shutters are pushed wide, and the air flows gently inside. A breeze carries the smell of dew still clinging to grass, mingled with the faint sweetness of herbs drying in bundles above the hearth. The weaver sits at the loom, threads stretched taut before them, the daylight falling across their lap in quiet stripes. Birds call from the hedgerows outside. A dog shifts sleepily near the door. The sound of the shuttle blends with these morning noises, weaving not only cloth but also a tapestry of daily atmosphere, where light and air are as much a part of the process as wool and flax. In winter, the picture shifts. The shutters may remain closed against biting winds, and the only illumination comes from firelight or a small rushlight burning near the loom. Yet even then, the window has its presence. Covered with cloth or thin parchment, it glows faintly with the pale suggestion of daylight beyond, reminding the weaver of the wider world, even when the cold keeps them enclosed. The air indoors is heavier now, filled with the mingled scents of wool, smoke, and damp wood. Herb sage, thyme, lavender hang in clusters to dry near the rafters, their fragrance slowly released by the warmth of the hearth. The loom sits in its corner, steady and patient, while the faint glow of the window gives the worker a sense of time passing, even in the darkest months. Children often gathered near the window too, sometimes playing with scraps of yarn or chasing shadows on the floor. A mother weaving could look up from her work and see her child framed against the light, their laughter carrying out into the lane. In this way, the window became a bridge between inside and outside, between labor and life, between the steady rhythm of the loom and the ever-changing rhythm of the village. The faint sounds drifting through the crow of a rooster, the clop of hooves on earth, the distant ringing of church bells were not interruptions but companions. They gave the weaver a sense of belonging, a reminder that their quiet work was part of the broader life of the community. Windows were also places of air, and air mattered greatly in a weaving household. The fibers themselves, wool and flax, needed to breathe. In damp conditions, they could mildew or become difficult to spin. A well-placed window, allowing breezes to flow through the cottage, kept the fibers dry and workable. In summer, the draft carried away the dust of combed wool. In winter, it refreshed the heavy scent of smoke. The weaving cottage thus lived, with the weather, its air shifting with the seasons, its comfort tied to the simple act of opening or closing a shutter. Weavers often chose to place their loom near the best window in the house, even if it meant crowding the family into smaller spaces. The loom demanded light, and the weaver needed to see each thread clearly. In some towns, loft windows were cut, specifically for this purpose, letting in slanted daylight that fell directly across the working frame. The angle of sunlight mattered, for it revealed the colors of yarn, helping the weaver to distinguish the pale blues of woad from the soft browns of walnut dye, or to line up the pattern of a narrow decorative band. Natural light, though imperfect, was gentler on the eyes than firelight, and so the day's weaving often rose and fell with the sun. Beyond their practical role, windows held symbolic weight to deframe the outside world like living pictures. Fields stretching into distance, smoke rising from neighboring chimneys, or a sudden shower darkening the sky. For the weaver, whose hours were often long and repetitive, such glimpses were a source of quiet renewal. Looking up from the shuttle's path to watch clouds drifting past, or to see a neighbor walking down the lane, offered a moment of rest. For the mind, it was not distraction, but balanced the reassurance that even as thread followed thread, life itself was moving steadily outside. In wealthier homes, where glass was set in leaded panes, the play of light took on another character. Color shifted as sun fell through wavy or tinted glass, casting gentle patterns across the loom. But for most, the effect came through simpler means. Cloth stretched thin, shutters angled to admit slivers of brightness, or even lattice covered with horn or parchment. These softened the harshness of light, turning it into something diffuse, something that could be endured for long hours without strain. The room, under such light, felt hushed and enveloping, as though the air itself was woven with gentleness. The scents that drifted through windows gave further texture to the weaving day. In spring, the sharp freshness of newly turned earth mingled with the faint sweetness of blossoms. In summer, fields of hay filled the air with a golden dryness. In autumn, smoke from burning leaves and the musk of ripened apples drifted indoors. Even in winter, the air carried its own quiet perfume, the metallic chill of frost, the faint tank of snow. Each season found its way into the cottage through the window, shaping the mood of weaving with subtle shifts of atmosphere. And so, windows of light and air were not simply architectural features, but quiet companions in the daily rhythm of medieval weaving. They softened the boundaries between inside and outside, between labor and life. They reminded the weaver of the world's beauty, even in the midst of repetition. They allowed threads to be seen clearly, colors to be judged, fibers to be kept sound. They carried scents, sounds, and breezes, weaving them into the fabric of the home, just as surely as the loom wove yarn into cloth. To imagine such a setting now is to imagine calm, a loom standing steady in the corner, light falling softly across the threads, the air shifting with the season, and beyond the shutter, the muffled life of a village unfolding. It was in this quiet atmosphere that weaving truly belonged, not only as a craft, but as part of the gentle fabric of daily existence. To live as a weaver in the Middle Ages was to live not only by the loom, but by the seasons. The cycle of the year was never distant. It pressed close, shaping labor, meals, sleep, and the very air within the cottage. The loom might stand steady, in its corner, always waiting, but the hands that worked it moved with the rhythm of fields, flocks, and skies. Just as cloth was never woven in haste, the passing of the year was never rushed. Each season unfolded with a patience that matched the slow tread of the shuttle, and the weaver followed it in step, month by month, thread by thread. Winter came first, deep and unhurried. Long nights stretched across the village, and though the cold pressed hard upon cottage walls, the weaver found time in the darkness to work by lamplight or firelight. Outside, the earth slept beneath frost, but inside, the loom clattered softly, echoing against the beams of the house. the steady glow of the hearth lit the warp threads, casting them in amber and gold. Winter was the season when weaving moved inward, when fields gave little to do and animals rested in barns. For weavers, these long evenings were a chance to build cloth for the months ahead, heavy woolens for cloaks, thick blankets for beds, garments to shield against the chill that seemed endless. The rhythm of winter weaving was different from summers. In the cold months, each movement was slower, weighed down by thick clothing and numb fingers. Yet there was a certain intimacy to it, for the family gathered close while the weaver worked. Children played in corners with scraps of yarn. Old stories were told beside the fire, and the sound of the shuttle became part of this enclosed life. Time stretched, not with haste, but with the patience of repetition. Winter weaving was never hurried. It was steady, almost contemplative, a way of passing through the dark hours with purpose and warmth. As winter loosened its hold, spring arrived gently, with buds on trees and flax fields stirring once more. Spring was a season of renewal, and for weavers, it meant preparation. Sheep were turned out to graze on fresh grass, their fleeces slowly thickening again after the long winter. Flax, that slender and pale plant, was sown in neat rows, its growth awaited with quiet care. Within the cottage, windows were opened wider now, letting in breezes and the scents of earth and flowers. The loom remained in use, of course, but spring's weaving was lighter, more hopeful. Linens were worked in softer threads, suitable for the warmer months to come. Spring also marked a shift in light. Days grew longer, and the weaver no longer relied on the dim flame of rushlights for so many hours. Sunlight streamed through shutters, illuminating the threads in a glow that revealed their true colors more clearly. The rhythm of weaving matched this brightness. Mornings were filled with the hum of work. Afternoons carried the steady sound of shuttle and treadle, and evenings stretched into twilight without haste. Spring weaving seemed almost to breathe, as if the cloth itself was lighter because the world outside was in bloom. By the time summer arrived, the pace of weaving adjusted again. Summer days were long, and with them came early rising. Work at the loom often began soon after dawn, when the air was still cool, and continued until the heat of midday urged rest. Windows were flung open, and the sounds of summer bees humming, cattle lowing in the meadows, children calling from fields, mingled with the steady rhythm of weaving indoors. Light cloths were made then, fine linens for shirts, light wool for garments that would be worn beneath the sun. Weaving in summer was not only for daily needs, but for storage and trade, for preparing bolts of fabric that could be sold in markets once the season's fairs arrived. Summer was also a season of interruption. The weaver's household could not ignore the demands of fields and flocks. There was hay to gather, gardens to tend, and at times, the loom stood quiet while hands worked the land. Yet even when days were filled with outdoor labor, weaving remained a steady anchor, returning in the evenings when shadows lengthened. A loom might stand still during the hottest hours, but by candlelight or twilight, the shuttle moved again, carrying summer's warmth into the threads. Autumn brought its own labors. It was the season of shearing and harvest, of gathering wool and retting flax. The weaver now handled raw materials as much as finished cloth. Wool from sheep was washed, carded, and spun, filling baskets with new skeins ready for the loom. Flax, pulled and dried, was beaten and combed, its fibers softened for spinning. Autumn was a busy season, filled with both fieldwork and weaving, a season when the household worked together to prepare for the winter ahead. The loom, once again, grew busy with heavy cloth. 4 colder days were approaching. There was a richness to autumn weaving. Colors deepened in dyes, drawn from plants gathered at their strongest. Madder roots gave red, woad gave blue, and walnut, husks, stained cloth in warm brown. The cloth woven in autumn seemed to echo the land itself. Fields golden from harvest, skies turning crisp and clear, smoke rising from fires in every cottage. As evenings grew cooler, the loom was not only a tool of work, but a source of comfort. Its familiar rhythm a reminder that life continued steadily, even as seasons changed. Thus, the year turned, and with it, weaving turned as well. The weaver's life was not separated from the land, but deeply entwined with it. Each season left its mark on the cloth. Winter's heaviness, spring's lightness, summer's length, autumn's depth. To wear such cloth was to wear the year itself, to feel the passing of time not only in memory, but in the texture of garments and blankets. A cloak woven in winter held the hush of snowbound evenings. A linen shirt woven in spring carried the brightness of open shutters and birdsong. A shawl woven in autumn bore the scent of smoke and harvest fields. The cycle of weaving through the year was, in truth, a cycle of patience. Nothing was rushed, for both loom and season demanded their own pace. Threads had to be spun, warps set up, patterns planned. Sheep had to be sheared when their fleeces were ready. Flax had to be pulled. At its moment of ripeness, the weaver could not command time but moved with it, step by step, as naturally as the shuttle passed through the shed. To stand in such a cottage now, in imagination, is to sense this rhythm still. One sees the loom by its window, the light shifting across it as months pass, the air carrying new scents with every season. One hears the shuttle, steady as a heartbeat, sounding through winter storms, spring rains, summer fields, and autumn winds. The weaver, patient and enduring, carries on, year after year, as time itself is woven into cloth. In this way, weaving was more than craft. It was a mirror of the earth's own turning. It was a partnership between human hands and the slow cycle of nature. And so, as the year wound forward from frost to thaw, from bloom to harvest, weaver worked not against time, but with it, weaving through the year in quiet harmony. Weaving was not a craft one mastered in a season, nor even in a handful of years. It was a slow inheritance, a knowledge gathered not in books but in the watchful silence of cottages, in the long patience of apprenticeships, in the everyday presence of loom and spindle. The art of weaving passed along as quietly as the passing of the seasons, moving from parent to child, from elder to youth, from master to apprentice. It was not only skill, but a way of living, and to learn it fully was to let its patience sink into one's very bones. In small cottages, learning began not with formal lessons but with watching. Children sat by the hearth while mothers spun wool into thread, their fingers dancing in motions too quick for young eyes to follow. The spindle fell and whirled, the distaff leaned against a shoulder, and the quiet hum of twisting fibers filled the air. Children played nearby, yet even in play, they absorbed the rhythm. They learned by nearness, by seeing the steady movements repeated day after day. Sometimes a child would be handed a bit of coarse wool, encouraged to twist it between small fingers. The result was lumpy and uneven, but no one scolded. The craft was learned slowly, through touch and familiarity. By the time those children grew tall enough to reach the loom, the sight and sound of weaving were already part of them. The loom stood as a constant presence in the cottage, a great wooden frame that seemed both ordinary and mysterious. They watched their fathers or mothers tread the pedals, pass the shuttle, beat the weft. The rhythm was steady, like breathing, and children came to know it as naturally as the sound of wind in the trees or bells from the church tower. When finally given a chance to place their own hands upon the shuttle, they did not begin as strangers, but as companions of a craft they had watched all their lives. Learning in such a way was not rushed. There were no deadlines, no sudden examinations. Instead, there was repetition, slow, patient repetition. A young weaver might spend weeks only helping with winding yarn, twisting skeins into balls, or setting the warp upon the loom under the guidance of an elder. It was a humble beginning, but it laid the foundation. To know weaving, one had to know not only the weaving itself, but the long preparation that made weaving possible. Children learned to respect thread because they had seen how many hours of spinning went into it. They learned to respect the loom because they had watched how much labor was needed to set the warp. Every small task was part of a whole, and through many years, the whole was revealed. In towns, the passing of the craft took on a more formal shape. Guilds oversaw apprenticeships, binding young boys and sometimes girls into contracts with master weavers. An apprentice might leave their family home to live under the roof of the master, serving not only at the loom, but in the household. They swept floors, tended fires, carried water, and wound endless skeins of yarn. Only gradually did their hands approach the loom itself. It was said that weaving could not be taught in words alone. It had to be lived. Apprenticeship was not only instruction in technique, but in discipline, in patience, in the rhythm of a weaver's life. The master guided with a steady hand, correcting mistakes, praising diligence, and reminding the young that cloth carried the reputation of the workshop. Mistakes were not punished harshly, but corrected with persistence, for no thread could be forced into straightness by anger. Instead, it had to be unraveled and begun again. In this way, the apprentice learned that weaving was not about haste, but about calm endurance. To weave was to accept imperfection, to mend it gently, and to begin anew without complaint. These lessons were as much about character as about cloth. For years, apprentices worked before they could be called journeymen. Their days stretched with the repetition of simple tasks, but within that repetition, skill took root. They learned the feel of wool and flax, the different tensions of warp, the strength needed to beat the weft into place. They came to know the sound of the loom as intimately as their own heartbeat. When at last they were judged ready, when they could weave cloth that met the standards of the guild, they were permitted to step out from under the master's roof and practice on their own. The passage from apprentice to journeyman was not a sudden transformation, but the culmination of countless quiet hours woven into the fabric of their lives. In villages where guilds held less sway, the transmission of weaving was even more intimate. Parents taught children, grandparents guided grandchildren. Families carried patterns and techniques as part of their own inheritance. Certain households were known for particular motifs or ways of finishing cloth, and these styles passed from generation to generation. A band of color on a hem, a subtle pattern hidden in the weave, a particular method of dyeing. These were family signatures, quiet marks of pride passed along as naturally as stories told by the fire. There was, too, a sense of sacred trust. In this passing, cloth was more than utility. It marked the moments of life itself. The hands that wove a wedding garment or a burial shroud had been trained by other hands, now long gone, and in that continuity there was reverence. A child learning to weave was not merely learning a skill for survival, but joining an unbroken chain linking past to future. Each new weaver carried forward the patience, diligence, and quiet devotion of those who came before. The slowness of the craft meant that impatience had no place in learning. A young weaver might grow restless, longing to master the loom quickly, but the craft itself resisted haste. Threads snarled when pulled too roughly, warps broke if tightened too much, cloth grew crooked if woven with uneven rhythm. The loom itself seemed to teach patience, demanding calm attention, rewarding steady hands. To pass the craft along was therefore not simply to hand down knowledge, but to hand down a way of being, a character shaped by patience and quiet industry. Festivals and gatherings often revealed the fruit of such teaching. In markets, cloth from many households and workshops lay side by side. Experienced weavers could tell at a glance which pieces came from practiced hands and which bore the unevenness of the inexperienced. Yet even the rougher cloth was respected, for it carried the efforts of learners, the promise of skill yet to come. No one expected perfection at once. The community understood that weaving, like life, grew smoother only through repetition, through seasons of practice. Stories lingered of great masters whose skills were unmatched, whose patterns seemed to breathe with life. Yet even these masters began humbly, winding yarn and watching the shuttle pass. Their greatness was not born in a moment, but nurtured across years of guidance, patience, and steady work. And always, when such masters neared the end of their lives, they sought apprentices to whom they might pass their knowledge, not wishing the thread of their art to be broken. Thus the craft endured, not by brilliance alone, but by the humble persistence of passing it along. One might say that weaving itself was a teacher. The loom gave lessons each day, in balance, in rhythm, in humility. Parents and masters guided, but the craft revealed itself only in practice. Children learned first by watching, then by trying, then by failing, and finally by succeeding. The pattern of learning was as gradual as the pattern of weaving. Each line of cloth was built from many threads, and each weaver was formed from many years. To pass the craft along, then, was not only to preserve a skill, but to preserve a way of life. It ensured that cottages remained filled with the sound of looms, that towns continued to hum with workshops, that festivals were adorned with banners, that weddings and funerals were marked with cloth carrying both beauty and memory. The act of teaching was itself a weaving, binding generations together as surely as threads bound warp and weft. And so, across centuries, the craft endured. Parents guided children, masters trained apprentices, communities honored the patient work of learners. The knowledge never truly belonged to one person alone. It was always held in trust, to be handed forward. Weaving was not hurried, nor was its teaching. Slowly, gently, the craft moved from hand to hand, carrying with it the patience of countless lives. In the quiet sound of the shuttle, one could hear not only the work of the present, but the voices of the past, whispering through the threads. When all is said, Weaving was never chiefly about the rare splendor of great tapestries that hung in castles or the magnificent banners displayed on feast days. Those were remarkable, yes, and they stirred wonder in the few who beheld them. Yet, the heart of weaving, its truest legacy, lay in the humbler threads of daily life. It was in the cloth that clothed families, the fabric that lined beds, the wool that softened against cold stone walls, and the linen that wrapped bread or newborns. Weaving was not an art of luxury alone, it was a steady necessity, a companion of every hour, as ordinary and essential as firewood or water. And in that ordinariness lay its greatness. Every cottage across the medieval countryside could tell its own quiet tale of cloth. On frosty mornings, heavy woolen cloaks, rough to the touch yet deeply warming, were drawn over shoulders before stepping out to tend the animals. These cloaks were not fine or grand. They bore mended patches, frayed edges, and the unease of hand-spun yarn, yet they held warmth, and with warmth came survival. In the weaving of such cloth, one could hear the true heartbeat of the age, not in splendid halls, but in the breath of villagers facing the elements with the simple gift of fabric. Beds, too, carried the mark of the loom. Beneath straw mattresses, linen sheets coarse, but clean offered a measure of comfort. Families lay down to rest beneath woolen blankets, woven thick against the winter air that crept through shuttered windows. These coverings were passed down, patched when worn thin, softened with use, until they bore the memory of generations. To lie beneath such cloth was not merely to sleep, it was to be enfolded in a continuity of care, in the work of mothers and fathers whose hands had spun, dyed, and woven the very threads. Cloth was more than fabric. It was a presence, a sheltering embrace that followed from cradle to grave. Consider the infants swaddled tightly in bands of linen. These narrow strips were woven especially for the purpose, their whiteness symbolizing purity and new beginnings. Mothers wrapped their children securely, keeping them warm and steady in a world that was still strange and wide. As the infant grew, cloth continued to mark each stage. Small shirts of rough linen, tunics of wool, cloaks for school or labor. Clothing was not abundance, it was precious, measured, and mended. A child might wear the garments of elder siblings, stitched to fit, the fabric softened by years of use. Thus weaving wove not only threads, but the bonds of family. Each piece of cloth carrying within it the quiet sacrifices of those who worked to keep their household clothed. Doors and windows, too, bore their coverings of fabric. Heavy cloth was hung to block drafts, to provide privacy, to mark a boundary between the intimate space of the home and the world beyond. In winter, these hangings muffled the howling wind and held in the warmth of the hearth. In summer, lighter cloth allowed air to move while keeping insects at bay. The household was stitched together by these simple hangings, which might seem plain but were essential to comfort. Even thresholds were softened with cloths or rush mats, woven in simple patterns, worn smooth by countless feet. The rhythm of daily chores was bound by fabric as well. Aprons tied at the waist protected clothing during works, pinning, cooking, tending fields. Sacks and bags of woven cloth carried grain, herbs, and tools. Towels, rough but absorbent, dried hands after labor. Table linens, plain or dyed, spread beneath shared meals, bearing witness to conversations and prayers. Each object of cloth seemed small, yet together they formed a vast, invisible tapestry that stretched across all of life. Without them, existence would have been harsher, colder, more fragile. Mending was itself a form of quiet weaving. When knees wore through trousers or elbows thinned on sleeves, patches were added, stitches reinforced. Nothing was cast aside quickly, for every scrap of cloth represented long hours of labor. A patched garment bore no shame. Rather, it carried pride in thrift and endurance. The sight of careful stitches spoke of hands that refused to waste, of families who knew how to stretch the life of what had been made. Thus, the tapestry of everyday life was not a fresh, flawless cloth, but one strengthened by mending, textured with use, alive with continuity. Festivals and holy days brought a brief flowering of color, yet even then, cloth remained grounded in its humble role. Banners were hoisted, embroidered pieces displayed in churches, households laid their finest linens upon the table. But these moments shone only because of the contrast with everyday simplicity. Most of the year was clothed in earth tones, grays, blues, muted by natural dyes, whites softened by time. In these shades, one saw the landscape itself: soil, sky, bark, water. The daily tapestry of life mirrored the earth that sustained it. Even laborers in the fields carried cloth with them in simple forms: a kerchief tied about the head to keep sweat from the eyes, a belt of woven cord to fasten a tunic, a bag slung across the shoulder for carrying tools or bread. These modest items made toil possible, easing the burdens of sun and soil. At the day's end, when garments were hung by the hearth to dry, the smell of earth and sweat clung to the fabric. Yet even this was a sign of the cloth's faithfulness, its role as constant companion to labor. And when the time of sickness came, cloth was again near. Beds were layered with extra blankets for the feverish, cool linen cloths laid upon the brow. When death arrived, the body was wrapped in a shroud, plain and unadorned, yet deeply meaningful. That final piece of cloth, simple though it was, bore the weight of tradition and reverence. It was woven with as much care as any garment, for it carried the beloved into rest. In this way, Cliff framed every stage of life, from the swaddling of birth to the winding of the shroud. The tapestry of everyday life was therefore not woven in grand halls, but in cottages, by hands that labored without fame. Each garment, each blanket, each bag was a thread in a larger whole, invisible yet essential. This tapestry bound families together, sheltered them against the world, and marked the passage of their days. Weaving was not only the creation of Cliff, it was the creation of continuity, of a life sustained quietly by fabric. When one steps back and considers this great tapestry, it stretches wider than any wall. It extends across centuries, across countless homes, across lives forgotten yet preserved in the memory of thread. The rare splendor of tapestries remains in museums, admired by distant eyes, but the truer legacy of weaving is in the invisible cloth of daily life, cloth that warmed, protected, bound, and remembered. It was a legacy as quiet as breath, as enduring as time itself. And so the tapestry of everyday life continues to whisper. In every piece of old cloth preserved, in every fragment dug from the earth, in every tale of spinning and weaving passed down, we hear its voice. It tells us that beauty does not only reside in grandeur, but in simplicity, that survival is itself a kind of art, and that the humblest threads can bind together the greatest of stories. At the end of all these chapters, when we pause and step back, what begins to appear is not simply a story of cloth, but a story of life itself. The threads that once stretched across medieval looms have long since worn away, their garments frayed, their blankets turned to dust. And yet, in another sense, they remain. For cloth was never just fabric, it was shelter, memory, continuity, and meaning. It was the silent witness to births and burials, to weddings and workdays, to the long rhythms of seasons and years. To speak of weaving is to speak of time, for every thread spun and woven was a moment captured, held, and carried forward. In this way, the story of medieval cloth is also the story of endurance, of patience, and of the quiet strength that ordinary lives possess. We have followed the craft from the fields of flax and the meadows of sheep, through the slow work of spinning and the vast, patient presence of the loom. We have watched colors drawn from roots and bark, and we have traced how cloth warmed bodies in winter and cooled them in summer. We have entered cottages lit by windows of softened light, listened to the whisper of tools and the hush of shuttles, and walked through the markets and guild halls where the humble work of hands met the wider world. In all of these places, cloth was not an ornament of luxury, but a constant companion, binding together survival and dignity, labor and rest, necessity and beauty. It is striking how much of this legacy belongs to silence. Unlike the clang of metal or the roar of engines, weaving spoke in whispers. The soft tread of treadles, the swish of a shuttle, the murmur of voices by the hearth as hands spun thread. Its presence was never loud, yet it endured with remarkable strength. Perhaps this is why the memory of weaving still moves us today. It reminds us that the foundations of life are often quiet, patient, and steady, not sudden or dramatic. A cloak patched many times, a blanket spread across generations, a linen shroud for the last sleep. These are not grand objects, but they are deeply human. They show how people met life's demands, not with spectacle, but with persistence and care. The lessons carried by weaving reach far beyond fabric. The rhythm of loom and spindle teaches us something about time itself. A thread is spun slowly, twisted twisted and drawn out, fragile at first, but stronger as it lengthens. So too does human life grow stronger through patience and practice, through the accumulation of small, steady efforts. A piece of cloth is not made in an hour, it is made through countless repetitions, each pass of the shuttle adding to what has already been built. In this sense, weaving becomes a mirror of how lives, families, and communities are formed. They are not created suddenly. They are woven patiently, thread by thread, day by day. Cloth also teaches us about connection. No single thread, however strong, is enough on its own. It must be bound to others, crossing over and under, giving way and holding firm, until together they create a fabric that endures. This is true of weaving, but it is also true of human society. Families, villages, guilds, and communities are woven from individuals whose lives intersect, whose efforts strengthen one another, whose patience and care create something greater than themselves. To see cloth is to see cooperation in its most tangible form. And there is beauty, too, though not always the loud beauty of splendor and display. Instead, there is the quiet beauty of patterns woven into daily garments, of dyes drawn from the earth, of cloth softened by years of use. There is beauty in the patched cloak, in the simple table linen, in the banner carried on a holy day. Such beauty is humble, but it is lasting, because it belongs to life itself. The human impulse to grace and pattern, even in modest households, reminds us that dignity and creativity dwell not only in grand works, but also in the simplest acts of care. What then does it mean to conclude the story of medieval weaving? On the surface, it means acknowledging that these practices by the hearth, dyeing with roots and leaves, weaving by lamplight, belong to a world long past. Mechanization, trade, and industry have changed the way cloth is made. The patience of handwork has been replaced by the speed of machines. And yet, the deeper story endures. We still live surrounded by fabric. We still measure our lives with cloth, from the clothes we wear to the linens we rest upon, from the blankets that warm us to the garments in which we are married or buried. The continuity remains, even if the methods have changed. The thread is eternal. To remember the weavers of the past is to honor those who lived without fame, whose names are lost, but whose labor sheltered generations. They did not carve stone, cathedrals, or write illuminated manuscripts. Their work was not meant to be admired centuries later, and yet, in its quiet way, it was no less vital. They clothed the builders of cathedrals, warmed the monks who copied manuscripts, carried infants in swaddling, and shrouded the dead in dignity. Their craft was the ground upon which all other works of life and culture rested. To overlook them is to overlook the very fabric of existence. As we close, it is worth imagining once more the scene of a cottage loom, standing near a window where daylight falls across the threads. The weaver sits patiently, passing the shuttle back and forth, the rhythm steady as breathing. Outside, children's voices drift faintly, a dog barks, church bells toll in the distance. Within this quiet space, a piece of cloth is growing slowly, gently, unremarkably. It will become a cloak, a blanket, a table covering. It will warm, protect, and endure. It is not a grand work, but it is essential. In this, we find the true heart of weaving, the ordinary made sacred by patience, the humble made enduring by care. And so, the story does not end. The cloths of the past have frayed, but the thread continues, woven now into our own time. Every garment we wear, every fabric that shelters us, is part of the same great tapestry. The weavers of medieval cottages, the spinners by their hearths, the dyers by their vats, they are still with us, not in their names or faces, but in the very fabric of our lives. Their work endures in silence, as quietly as breath, as enduring as time itself.